What if the Anunnaki never really left, and the signs are all around you? Ancient Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as powerful beings connected to human civilization and hidden knowledge, but some theories claim their influence didn't end in the ancient world. From strange synchronicities to vivid dreams and unexplained feelings of connection, many believe there are subtle signs the Anunnaki may still be interacting with humanity today. But are these experiences truly connected to something ancient and mysterious? Or is the human mind simply searching for meaning? In this video, we explore 5 signs the Anunnaki may be with you right now, and the theories behind this controversial idea. There is a question that has lived at the edge of human consciousness for as long as human beings have been capable of asking questions. It is a question that appears in the oldest written records ever discovered. It is carved into temple walls that predate the pyramids. It is encoded in mythologies that stretch across cultures that had no contact with one another, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and continent. And it is a question that modern science, despite all of its instruments and all of its ambition, has never fully answered. The question is simple. Were we alone at the beginning? Were we the first ones here? Or did something else, something older, something vastly more intelligent, something that came from a place far beyond the boundaries of this world, look at this planet and decide to intervene? For decades, this question was confined to the fringes. It was the territory of conspiracy theorists, of fringe archaeologists, of people who looked at structures like the Great Pyramid of Giza and refused to accept the standard explanations. But something has been shifting, something significant. In the last 15 years, mainstream institutions that would never have entertained these ideas, NASA, the Pentagon, the Vatican itself, have begun to make quiet, cautious admissions. They have begun to acknowledge that the universe is teeming with conditions that could support life. They have begun to declassify documents about unidentified aerial phenomena. And they have begun to look more carefully at the ancient record, at the tablets and the temple inscriptions and the mythological texts, and to ask whether the people who wrote those things were describing metaphor or whether they were describing something they had actually witnessed. This script is not about UFOs in the modern sense. It is not about crop circles or abductions or any of the sensationalized material that tends to dominate popular conversations about extraterrestrial life. This script is about something far more specific, far more ancient, and far more personal than any of that. This script is about the Anunnaki, and more importantly, it is about you. The word Anunnaki appears in Sumerian cuneiform, the oldest writing system ever discovered on Earth. The tablets on which it is written are over 5,000 years old. They were pressed into clay in the region we now call southern Iraq, in cities with names like Eridu, and Nippur, and Ur. The Sumerians who wrote these tablets described a pantheon of divine beings, a group of gods who came from the sky, who established civilization, who shaped human beings from the earth, and who governed the affairs of the world from above and below. The Anunnaki were not abstract deities in the way that the gods of later religions became. They were not symbols or metaphors. In the Sumerian texts, they are described in startlingly practical terms. They have hierarchies and bureaucracies. They have disputes and alliances. They arrive in vessels. They give specific instructions. They are measured and weighed and described with a kind of administrative precision that does not resemble mythology. It resembles a historical record. The scholar who brought the Anunnaki to global attention in the modern era was Zecharia Sitchin. Born in Baku, Azerbaijan in 1920, Sitchin was one of a small number of scholars in the 20th century who could read ancient Sumerian cuneiform, and he spent decades translating the clay tablets that had been unearthed in Mesopotamia throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. What he found in those tablets did not match the standard academic narrative. The standard narrative said the Sumerians were imaginative but primitive people who invented gods out of their observations of nature. The sun became a god, the storm became a god, the river became a god. Sitchin's translation suggested something entirely different. The tablets were not the products of imagination. They were accounts of actual beings, physical beings, beings with technology, beings who had come to Earth from another planet in the solar system. a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru, which moved in an enormous elliptical orbit that brought it close to the inner solar system roughly every 3,600 years. Sitchin's interpretations have been both celebrated and attacked. Academic scholars of Mesopotamian studies have consistently criticized specific elements of his translations, arguing that his interpretations of certain words and phrases were selective and sometimes inaccurate. These criticisms are real and should be acknowledged. Sitchin was working at the edge of what the available evidence could support, and in some cases, he stepped beyond that edge. But here is what his critics rarely acknowledge: the basic textual reality. The Sumerian tablets do describe beings called the Anunnaki. They do describe these beings descending from the sky. They do describe the creation of a being called the Lulu, a creature made from divine and earthly elements combined. And they do describe a cosmic order in which these beings played a direct, hands-on role in the development of civilization on Earth. Whether Sitchin's specific interpretations of every detail are correct is a legitimate debate. That the tablets describe something extraordinary is not. The name Anunnaki translates most commonly as those who came from heaven to earth, or princely offspring of Anu. Anu was the highest god in the Sumerian pantheon, the Sky Father, the ruler of the heavens. His children, the Anunnaki, were sent to Earth to fulfill a specific mission. In the earliest Sumerian texts, that mission is described as the extraction of minerals from the earth. The Anunnaki came to mine, they established bases, they built cities. And when the labor of mining became too burdensome for even divine beings to sustain, the younger Anunnaki, called the Igigi, rebelled. It was in response to this rebellion that the decision was made to create a worker species, a being that could carry the load, a being that could be shaped from the available biological material on the planet and infused with the divine essence that the Anunnaki carried. That being was the human being, and the Anunnaki leader most associated with this creation was called Enki. Enki is one of the most fascinating figures in all of ancient mythology. He appears in Sumerian texts as the god of wisdom, water, intelligence, magic, and creation. He is associated with the Abzu, the primordial waters, the deep source of knowledge and life. He is described as the being who took the raw material of the earth and combined it with the essence of the Anunnaki to fashion the first humans, and he is, throughout the texts, portrayed as a protector of humanity. Where other Anunnaki regarded the human creation as a practical tool, workers to be used and discarded, Enki seems to have cared about what he made. There are passages in the Sumerian texts in which Enki warns human beings of coming catastrophes, in which he shares knowledge that was not meant to be shared, in which he advocates for the preservation of humanity against the plans of other Anunnaki who would have preferred to let them perish. Enki is the serpent in the garden. He is the bringer of forbidden knowledge, and he is, in the oldest versions of the story, not the villain. He is something closer to humanity's first ally. The reason this matters, the reason we are beginning here, in the deep past, in the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, is that understanding the origin of the Anunnaki relationship with humanity is essential for understanding the 5 signs we are going to be exploring in this script. Because the signs are not random, they are not coincidences, they are not neurological anomalies or psychological curiosities. They are the residue of a connection that is ancient beyond the capacity of ordinary language to describe. They are the fingerprints of a relationship that began before recorded history, that shaped the structure of the human brain and the architecture of human DNA, and that has never fully ended. The Anunnaki did not simply leave. They did not complete their mission, pack their technology, and vanish into deep space. The record, both the ancient record and the record that is being written right now in the experiences of millions of people around the world, suggests that they have remained present, engaged, watching, and in specific cases, actively communicating. This is the context in which the 5 signs must be understood, not as proof of alien visitation in the sensationalized Hollywood sense, not as evidence of abduction or implantation or any of the fear-based narratives that tend to surround this territory, but as evidence of something far more intimate, far more personal, a connection between certain human beings and the intelligences that shape them, a connection that can express itself in dreams, in sudden surges of inexplicable knowledge, in physical sensations that have no medical explanation, in numerical patterns that appear with impossible regularity, and in a particular kind of longing, a cosmic homesickness that has no earthly reference point because its source is not earthly. Before we move into the 5 signs themselves, it is worth spending some time with the question of why this subject has become so urgent right now, in this particular moment in human history. Because it has. If you have found this content, you are likely someone who has felt something that doesn't quite fit within the ordinary frameworks your culture has provided for you. You may have had experiences that you haven't been able to explain. You may have felt drawn to ancient history, to Sumerian texts, to the pyramids, to the stars, in ways that feel less like casual intellectual interest and more like the recognition of something you already knew. You may have had dreams that felt more real than waking life. You may have woken up with knowledge you don't remember acquiring. You may have felt, in certain moments of stillness, the presence of something vast and intelligent and utterly non-threatening, something that seemed to know you, not in the way another person knows you, but in the way a parent knows a child before the child can even form words. These experiences are not rare. They are reported by people across every culture, every demographic, every religious background, every level of education. They are reported by scientists and farmers, by mystics and engineers, by children and elderly people who have lived their entire lives without any interest in ancient mythology or extraterrestrial theories. And they cluster. They tend to appear together in the same individuals with a consistency that strongly suggests they are not random. They are the 5 signs, and the first step toward understanding them is understanding the system they come from. The Sumerian cosmology was not a simple one. It was not the kind of mythology that assigns human personalities to natural forces and calls it a religious system. It was a layered, complex, internally consistent account of how the universe is structured, how intelligence moves through that structure, and how the various levels of that structure interact with one another. The Anunnaki existed at a particular level in that structure. They were not the highest beings. Above them was Anu. And above Anu, in the oldest and most esoteric readings of the Sumerian texts, there was a principle that the texts sometimes called the Source, or the All, a primordial intelligence from which all other intelligence derived. The Anunnaki were not gods in the sense that later monotheistic religions would use that word. They were beings of enormous capability, beings with technology and knowledge that far exceeded what early humanity could comprehend. But they were not omnipotent. They were not omniscient. They were, in the deepest and most important sense, kin, advanced kin, ancient kin, but kin nonetheless. This kinship is encoded in human DNA. It is encoded in the architecture of the human brain. It is encoded in the capacity for symbolic thought, for abstract reasoning, for the kind of self-reflection that asks the very questions this script is exploring. The standard evolutionary narrative cannot adequately account for the speed at which human cognitive capacity developed. The gap between the cognitive abilities of our nearest primate relatives and the cognitive abilities of the earliest Homo sapiens is not gradual. It is sudden. It is dramatic. It is the kind of developmental leap that evolutionary biologists refer to, quietly and uncomfortably, as a saltation, a jump, something that the standard model of gradual natural selection does not easily explain. The Sumerian texts offer an explanation. It may not be the explanation that modern science is comfortable with, but it is coherent, it is internally consistent, and it is, in the most fundamental sense, a story about us, about who we are, about where we came from, and about what we carry inside us that we have not yet fully understood. The 5 signs we are about to explore are not signs that you are special in a way that elevates you above other people. They are not signs of superiority or selection in any hierarchical sense. They are signs of activation, of a genetic and spiritual inheritance that is latent in all human beings, but that is coming online, waking up, becoming active in specific individuals at this specific moment in history. Why now? That is a question we will address as we move through each of the signs. The short answer is this. The timeline that the Anunnaki established for human development, encoded in the mythological cycles, in the astrological ages, in the precession of the equinoxes, is coming to a critical inflection point. The age we are entering is not the same as the age we are leaving. Something is shifting. Something that was dormant is waking, and the signs of that awakening are what we are here to map. We will begin with the first and perhaps the most universal of the 5 signs. The one that has been reported across every culture and every era of human history. The one that is intimate and overwhelming and often terrifying in its vividness. The one that happens while you are sleeping, but does not feel like sleep. The dreams. The record before the record, what history was hiding. Before we arrive at the first sign, there is essential groundwork to lay, because if you are going to recognize the signs of Anunnaki presence in your own life, you need to understand the scope of what we are actually talking about. You need to understand how deep the roots go, how wide the influence spread, and how systematically the evidence of this ancient relationship has been minimized, misclassified, or outright suppressed in the academic and cultural mainstream. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a matter of historical record. The suppression of inconvenient evidence is not a feature unique to modern institutions. It is a feature of every civilization that has ever existed. And in the case of the Anunnaki, the suppression has been both deliberate and consequential. Let us start in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the region that gave birth to the first cities, the first writing, the first legal codes, the first astronomical observations, the first calendar systems, and the first organized religious institutions that human beings ever created. The civilization that emerged in this region, Sumer, appears in the archaeological record with a suddenness that has confounded scholars for well over a century. Around 3500 BCE, something remarkable happened. A people who had been living in relatively simple agricultural communities suddenly developed a fully formed civilization, not incrementally, not gradually, suddenly. They had cities with populations in the tens of thousands. They had a writing system capable of conveying complex, abstract thought. They had a mathematical system based on the number 60, a base 60 system that was sophisticated enough to calculate the movements of celestial bodies with remarkable accuracy. They had legal structures, administrative systems, agricultural techniques, architectural methods, and cosmological frameworks that would not be surpassed in the ancient world for thousands of years. The academic explanation for this is diffusionism, the idea that knowledge and techniques spread from one culture to another through trade and contact. But diffusionism requires a source. If Sumerian civilization diffused from somewhere, we need to be able to identify where that somewhere was, and we cannot. There is no earlier culture that possessed all of the elements that Sumer possessed at its emergence. The technologies and knowledge systems that define early Sumerian civilization appear to have arrived essentially complete, without the kind of developmental progression that we would expect to find if they had evolved organically from simpler antecedents. The Sumerians themselves had a very clear explanation for this. They said that the knowledge was given to them. It was given by the Anunnaki, by specific Anunnaki whose names they recorded, Enki, who gave them mathematics and writing and the arts of civilization, Inanna, who taught them warfare and desire, Enlil, who governed their laws and their agricultural systems. The knowledge was a gift, an inheritance, and it came from above. Now, one of the most significant pieces of evidence that connects the Sumerian account to a literal, rather than purely metaphorical reality, is the Sumerian king list. This is one of the oldest historical documents ever discovered, a tablet that lists the rulers of Sumerian city-states from the very beginning of civilization through the period known to modern archaeologists as the early dynastic period. What makes this document extraordinary, and what makes it so uncomfortable for mainstream scholarship, is that the king list begins with a period before the Great Flood, in which individual kings are said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years. The first king listed, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor ruled for 36,000 years. These are not typos. They are not errors. The numbers appear with extraordinary specificity. and they are mathematically structured using the same base 60 system that the Sumerians used for all of their calculations. The mainstream explanation is that these are mythological figures, that the impossibly long reigns are symbolic, but the tablet does not treat them as symbolic. It treats them as historical. It lists them alongside later kings whose reigns are of entirely normal human duration, with no indication that there is a categorical difference between the earlier and later portions of the list. What does the king list tell us? It tells us that in the Sumerian understanding of history, there was a period before the flood, before the catastrophic global event that appears in Sumerian mythology as the story of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, in which the beings who governed the earth were not human. They were the Anunnaki. They ruled directly. They sat on thrones in physical form, and the lengths of their reigns, measured in the base 60 system, suggest lifespans and temporal scales that are entirely consistent with the idea of beings from a different biological and evolutionary lineage, beings for whom the standard human lifespan would have been, in relative terms, a matter of weeks. After the flood, which the Sumerian texts describe in extraordinary detail, including the divine decision to destroy humanity, the counter-decision of Enki to warn one righteous man, the building of a great vessel, the survival of a remnant, and the resettlement of civilization, the nature of the Anunnaki presence changes. The direct kingship gives way to indirect rule. The Anunnaki no longer sit on thrones. Instead, they select human beings to serve as their representatives, as intermediaries, as the interface between the divine and the mundane. The kings of the post-flood period are still described as having been chosen by the gods, legitimized by divine appointment. But the gods are no longer physically present in the same way they were before. They have, in the language of the texts, ascended. They have moved upward. They have, perhaps, withdrawn to a higher level of operation, one that communicates through channels other than direct physical contact. This shift from direct Anunnaki rule to indirect influence through chosen intermediaries is enormously significant for our purposes, because it is the beginning of the pattern that continues to the present day. The Anunnaki did not vanish. They did not cease to exist. They did not simply stop caring about the civilization they had established. What happened is more subtle and more interesting. They changed the nature of their communication. Instead of speaking directly to human beings in physical form, they began to communicate through dreams, through visions, through the sudden illumination of understanding, the download of knowledge that comes seemingly from nowhere, through the language of number and symbol, through the deep, wordless pull of longing that draws a person towards something they cannot name. The Akkadian civilization that succeeded Sumer continued to record these communications. The Babylonian texts that followed the Akkadian period, including the famous Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserve the same essential framework, the same cast of divine characters, the same cosmic backstory, albeit translated into a different cultural context and filtered through a different political agenda. And what is remarkable is that as you follow this thread forward in time, through the Egyptian New Kingdom, through the Hebrew scriptures, through the Greek religious traditions, through the Hindu Vedas, through the Zoroastrian texts of ancient Persia, you find the same themes recurring: beings from the sky who interacted with early humanity, catastrophic floods, the gift of knowledge, chosen individuals who receive communications through dreams, numerical patterns of cosmic significance, and a persistent sense, encoded in all of these traditions, that the relationship between humanity and these ancient intelligences is not over, that it is ongoing, that it will culminate in something. A return, an awakening, a transformation that is yet to come. The Hindu tradition is particularly rich in Anunnaki parallel material. The Vedic gods, the Devas, are described in texts that predate the classical Sanskrit period as beings who came from a celestial realm to interact with early humanity. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, contains hymns that describe vehicles called vimanas, flying craft, that transported the gods across the sky. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana, the two great epic texts of Hindu tradition, contain detailed descriptions of aerial warfare, of weapons of mass destruction, of divine beings with physical bodies who fought battles and formed alliances and created offspring with human beings. The parallels with the Sumerian texts are not coincidental. They are too specific, too consistent, too structurally similar to be the result of independent mythological invention. They are accounts of the same events, filtered through different cultural lenses. The same argument can be made for the Mesoamerican traditions. The Maya and the Aztec and the Toltec all maintained mythological frameworks in which civilization was established by beings who arrived from the sky. The Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, is described in terms that are strikingly consistent with the Sumerian descriptions of Enki. Both are associated with wisdom, water, serpents, and the gift of civilizing knowledge. Both are portrayed as defenders of humanity against the more destructive impulses of other divine beings, and both are associated with a departure, a withdrawal, that carries with it the promise of return. Quetzalcoatl leaves, but Quetzalcoatl will come back. The timing of his return was calculated with extraordinary precision by the Maya astronomers, using a calendar system of such mathematical sophistication that it continues to astonish modern astronomers. The Australian Aboriginal tradition, which represents the oldest continuous cultural tradition on Earth, stretching back at least 65,000 years, contains accounts of beings called the Sky People or the Wandjina who descended from the heavens, shaped the landscape, established the laws and customs of the people, and then withdrew to their celestial realm while maintaining an ongoing relationship with the people through dream communication. The Wandjina accounts are among the oldest oral traditions in human history, and they describe something remarkably consistent with the Anunnaki framework in terms of their essential structure: beings from beyond, gifts of knowledge, ongoing communication through the medium of dream, a relationship that is ancient, intimate, and very much alive. None of this is coincidence. The patterns are too consistent, too cross-cultural, too deeply embedded in the oldest layers of human memory to be dismissed as parallel mythological invention. They are the record, fragmented, translated, reinterpreted through thousands of years of cultural evolution of a single original set of experiences. Experiences that were so formative, so foundational, so cosmically significant that they left their imprint on the collective human psyche in a way that time has not been able to erase. The Anunnaki did not just shape human civilization, they shaped human consciousness. They shaped the architecture of the human mind, and the signs of their ongoing presence in human experience are not things that happened to ancient people in a distant past. They are things that are happening right now to real people in the present moment. The question of why this awareness is intensifying now is one we will return to throughout this script, but the short version is this: the planetary cycle that the Anunnaki calendar described, a cycle tied to the orbit of Nibiru and to the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle measured in units of 3,600 years, has been building toward a particular inflection point. The precessional cycle, which takes approximately 25,120 years to complete, is itself a nested cycle within the longer Anunnaki timeline. And the moment we are currently moving through, the transition from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, which Western astrology has been tracking for centuries, corresponds to a critical juncture in the Anunnaki schedule. It is a juncture at which, if the ancient accounts are to be believed, the veil between the Anunnaki's level of operation and our own becomes thinner, at which the channels of communication that have been relatively quiet for millennia become more active, at which the signs of their presence become more frequent, more intense, more impossible to ignore. If you are watching or reading this right now, the probability is high that you have already experienced at least one of the 5 signs we are about to describe. The probability is also high that, at least in some cases, you have not recognized them for what they were. That is the purpose of what follows. Not to create belief from nothing, but to provide a framework for recognizing and understanding experiences that you may have already had, experiences that felt inexplicable or overwhelming or isolating precisely because you had no context in which to place them. The 5 signs are specific. They are empirically describable. They have been reported consistently across thousands of years of human testimony, and they are, each of them, pointing to the same underlying reality. The Anunnaki are not a historical curiosity. They are not a mythological footnote. They are an intelligence that is present, that is active, that has a stake in what happens to this species, and that communicates in ways that most human beings have not been trained to receive. The training begins now. We have built the foundation. We have established the historical and cultural context. We have traced the thread from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer through the mythologies of every major human civilization to the present moment. Now we are ready to enter the heart of the material. Now we are ready to explore, in depth and with precision, the 5 signs that the Anunnaki are with you right now. And we begin with the one that is perhaps the most intimate, the most startling, and the most ancient channel of communication that exists between the human mind and the intelligences that shaped it. The first sign is the dream that is not a dream. Sign 1. The dream that is not a dream. Human beings have been dreaming for as long as human beings have existed, but not all dreams are the same. Every culture that has ever existed on this planet has drawn a distinction, sometimes explicit, sometimes intuitive, always consistent, between 2 fundamentally different kinds of dream experience. The first kind is what modern neuroscience calls ordinary REM sleep, the processing of daytime experience, the consolidation of memory, the neural maintenance activity that the sleeping brain performs as a matter of biological routine. These dreams are typically fragmented, inconsistent, and emotionally variable. They draw from the raw material of waking experience and recombine it in ways that are often bizarre, often amusing, and rarely coherent. You forget most of them before you have fully woken up. The second kind of dream is something else entirely. The second kind has been called, across different cultures and different eras, by many different names. The Sumerians called them mes, divine transmissions, sacred communications sent by the gods to sleeping humans. The ancient Egyptians had an entire practice built around them, which they called incubation dreaming, the deliberate induction of states in sacred temple precincts designed to facilitate contact with the divine through the medium of sleep. The Greeks had the Asclepieia, the dream temples of Asclepius, where the sick and the searching would sleep on stone floors hoping for diagnostic or prophetic visions from the god. The Hebrew prophets received their most significant communications in this state. Jacob's ladder, Ezekiel's vision of the wheel, Daniel's night visions are all described in terms that make clear they are not being presented as ordinary dreams. The Islamic tradition distinguishes sharply between ordinary dreams, which arise from ordinary psychological processes, and what is called a ruya, a true vision, a communication from a source beyond the individual psyche. The Hindu tradition has elaborate frameworks for understanding what occurs in the deepest states of sleep, frameworks that describe contact with levels of intelligence that exist beyond the personal mind. The Aboriginal Australian tradition maintains that the dream time, the realm of the ancestors, the foundational layer of reality from which the physical world derives its structure, is accessible precisely in the state of dreaming, not as a metaphor, as a literal destination. All of these traditions are pointing to the same phenomenon, a state of consciousness that is distinct from ordinary dreaming, a state that is characterized not by fragmentation and inconsistency, but by overwhelming vividness, extraordinary coherence, and an emotional intensity that tends to persist long after waking, sometimes for days, sometimes for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. A state in which the dreamer encounters beings, receives information, witnesses events, or undergoes experiences that possess a quality the dreamers themselves consistently describe in the same language across thousands of years, more real than real. This is the first sign, not just dreams. Not vivid dreams in the ordinary sense, the specific experience of encountering something in the dream state that is qualitatively different from any other category of experience, something that carries the unmistakable signature of an intelligence that is not your own. Let us be precise about what this experience involves, because precision matters here. The encountered dream, as we will call it for the purposes of this script, has a consistent phenomenological profile. It tends to begin differently from ordinary dreams. Rather than the gradual semi-amnesiac slide into a dream narrative that characterizes ordinary REM sleep, the encounter dream typically begins with a sharp transition, a quality of suddenly being somewhere, of arriving rather than drifting. The environment in which the dreamer finds themselves is often ancient. Temple structures, stone halls, landscapes that are recognizable as Earth but somehow more saturated, more geometrically precise, more architecturally deliberate than any landscape the dreamer has consciously encountered. Often there are columns. Often there is light, not the diffuse, ambient light of ordinary dream environments, but a specific, directed, luminous quality that seems to emanate from surfaces and from the air itself, as if matter and light have a different relationship in this space than they do in waking physical reality. The beings encountered in these dreams do not generally appear as the anthropomorphic gods of conventional religious iconography. They do not have halos. They do not have wings in the way that Christian angels do. They do not perform miracles in the theatrical sense. What they tend to have, what people who report these encounters describe with remarkable consistency, is height. They are tall, often dramatically so. They have an air of antiquity about them that is difficult to describe, but impossible to mistake. They carry themselves with a quality of absolute composure, of a kind of patience that is not passive, but is rather the patience of something that has been waiting for an extremely long time and knows, with complete certainty, that the waiting was worth it. They communicate, most of the time, not in ordinary spoken language. Their communication is more direct than language. It arrives in the dreamer's consciousness as complete understanding, as a packet of knowing that lands all at once, that has already been fully formed by the time it reaches the dreamer's awareness, the way sunlight arrives already warm rather than arriving as cold photons that have to be converted. The content of these communications varies, but the form is consistent, and the emotional quality of the encounter is something that people who have had it struggle to articulate for years afterward. The closest approximation in ordinary human emotional language is recognition, not familiarity in the sense of having met someone before. Recognition in a deeper sense. The recognition of something that was a part of you that you did not know was missing until you found it again. People who have had these encounters often describe the aftermath in terms of being permanently changed, not in the sense of having had a mystical or religious conversion experience, though that can certainly be part of it. Changed in a more specific, more structural sense. Their relationship to time changes. Their relationship to their own intelligence changes. They begin to know things they did not know before. Not in the way that learning works, not as information retrieved from memory, but as understanding that simply appears to be present in them in the aftermath of the encounter, the way that a seed is present in soil before it has broken the surface. They develop a different relationship to the question of who they are. Not a crisis of identity, but a quiet, deepening certainty about an identity that goes far beyond their ordinary biographical narrative. And they tend, almost universally, to develop an intense and specific interest in ancient history, in Sumerian mythology, in the stars, in the architectural wonders of the ancient world, as if the encounter in the dream was a message, and the interest that follows is the beginning of decoding it. The Sumerian texts are remarkably specific about the mechanism of this kind of communication. In the Sumerian framework, the human being is not simply a biological organism with a brain that generates consciousness. The human being is a dual entity, a physical body animated by a divine essence that the Sumerians called the Giddim. The Giddim was not identical to what later religious traditions would call the soul, though it overlaps with that concept. The Giddim was specifically described as the divine element, the Anunnaki element, that was incorporated into the human being at the moment of creation. It was the part of the human that remembered where it came from. And in the state of sleep, when the ordinary waking biological brain stepped back and the deeper structures of consciousness became active, the Giddim could communicate with its source. The Anunnaki could reach the Giddim directly, through the medium of dream, and through the Giddim they could reach the human being. This is a framework that is not unique to Sumer. It appears in essentially the same form in ancient Egypt, where the human being is understood as a composite entity, the physical body, the Ka, the double, the energy body, the Ba, the individual soul, the Ak, the immortal, divine element that was of celestial origin. The Ak was the part of the human being that could travel to the stars in sleep. The ancient Egyptians built their funerary architecture with extraordinary precision around the movement of specific stars, most prominently Orion and Sirius, and scholars have increasingly recognized that this was not merely symbolic, but was rather connected to a specific cosmological and astronomical understanding of the relationship between human consciousness, stellar mechanics, and the nature of the intelligence that had shaped human civilization. The Egyptian understanding of the afterlife was not simply a comforting fantasy about a pleasant realm beyond death. It was a cosmological map, a precise description of the journey that the Ak, the divine element, took when it was freed from the constraints of the physical body and of the intelligences it would encounter on that journey. What does this mean in practical terms for the person experiencing these dreams today? It means that when you wake up from one of these encounters, shaking perhaps, or in tears, or in a state of profound peace that is entirely at odds with the intensity of what you experienced, and you try to explain it to yourself using the ordinary categories your culture has provided, you are inevitably going to come up short. Your culture will offer you a handful of explanations. It will suggest that you had a vivid dream caused by stress, or by something you ate, or by a neurologically interesting period of REM sleep. It will suggest, if you are religiously inclined, that you had a divine encounter of the kind described in your particular religious tradition. It will suggest, if you are psychologically inclined, that you encountered a deep archetype of the collective unconscious in the Jungian sense. All of these explanations contain elements of truth. None of them is complete. None of them fully accounts for the specificity of the beings encountered, the coherence of the communications received, or the lasting transformation of the person who experienced it. None of them accounts for the remarkable cross-cultural consistency of the reports, or for the specific archaeological and historical details that people sometimes encounter in these dreams. Details about ancient civilizations, ancient languages, ancient cosmological frameworks that they had never encountered in their waking education. There is a particular subcategory of this first sign that deserves special attention. It involves dreams not of ancient temples or ancient beings, but of the stars, specifically of travel among the stars. The dreamer finds themselves moving through space, not the cold, dark, silent space of modern astronomy, but a space that feels inhabited, a space that pulses with intelligence, a space in which certain star systems carry a quality of the familiar, of home, in a way that is both inexplicable and overwhelming. People report this experience with startling consistency. The emotional quality is almost universally described as a profound, bittersweet recognition, the recognition of a home that you have been separated from for an incomprehensibly long time. A home that you know, at some level beneath the level of rational thought, that you are going to return to, but not yet, not in this form, not in this life. And the star systems most frequently reported in these travel dreams are specific. They are not random. They cluster around a small number of constellations, most prominently Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, and a region near the constellation Taurus that the Sumerians associated with the location of Nibiru in their astronomical records. The Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, as they are called in virtually every human mythological tradition, hold a particularly prominent place in the Anunnaki cosmological framework. The Sumerians associated the Pleiades with the Anunnaki Council, the seven great Anunnaki who made the key decisions regarding Earth and humanity. Ancient star maps found in various Mesopotamian sites show the Pleiades in a position of cosmological centrality that is not justified by their astronomical prominence alone. They are not the brightest stars. They are not the most navigational significant, but they are marked in ancient astronomical records from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Mesoamerica to the Pacific Islands as the most important cluster in the sky. Robert Bauval's research on the stellar alignment of the Giza pyramids and Graham Hancock's subsequent work on the global pattern of ancient sites that appear to mirror specific star constellations has added a physical, archaeological dimension to this picture that is difficult to dismiss. The ancient builders, whether they were human or whether they were working from plans provided by something other than human, were encoding information about stellar geography into the landscape of the Earth. They were making maps. And the dreams that people have today, the dreams of traveling among specific star systems, suggest that the map is still being read, that the code is still being transmitted, that the intelligence which established the connection between the stars above and the monuments below has not stopped communicating through the medium of human dreaming. There are specific triggers for these dreams that people report, and it is worth cataloging them. The first is archaeological or historical exposure, reading about Sumer or Egypt or any of the ancient civilizations that were built according to the Anunnaki template. People frequently report that after reading a specific text or visiting a specific ancient site or watching a specific documentary, they had their first encounter dream that night, as if the external exposure to the material activated something internal, something that was waiting to be woken up. The second common trigger is a specific kind of emotional openness, a period of grief or of profound searching, or of the kind of spiritual crisis that comes when the frameworks you have been given for understanding your life are no longer adequate to the experience you are having. These periods seem to create a kind of permeability in the ordinary defenses of the waking mind, and in that permeability, the deeper channel of communication becomes accessible. The third trigger is meditation or specific contemplative practice, particularly practices that involve attention to the breath, stillness of the body, and the deliberate quieting of ordinary mental chatter. The ancient temples that were built specifically for incubation dreaming, the Asclepia of the Greeks, the Sed festival structures of ancient Egypt, the kivas of the Pueblo people of the American Southwest, were all designed to facilitate exactly this state, a state of bodily stillness combined with heightened consciousness in which the ordinary barriers between the individual mind and the deeper layers of intelligence become thin. The fourth trigger is one that surprises people when they first hear it, but that becomes clear upon reflection: music. Specifically, music that contains the harmonic ratios embedded in the Anunnaki mathematical system, the base 60 harmonic ratios that underlie the acoustic structures of certain ancient forms of chant, of certain frequencies used in modern sound healing, and of the mathematical relationships between musical notes that Pythagoras described when he returned from his years studying in Egypt and Babylonia. Pythagoras was not inventing these relationships, he was transmitting them. They are encoded in the structure of the cosmos, in the relationship between planetary orbits that Johannes Kepler would later call the music of the spheres. And when human beings are exposed to these ratios, in the right context, in the right state of receptivity, they tend to become portals, not metaphorically. The experience of encountering these sound frequencies in a state approaching sleep or meditation is consistently reported as the beginning of an encountered dream rather than an ordinary one. The question that naturally arises at this point is, what do you do with these experiences? If you have had them, if you recognize in this description something that has happened to you, what is the appropriate response? The worst thing you can do, in the assessment of every tradition that has ever worked systematically with this kind of experience, is to dismiss it. Dismissal does not make the experience less real. It simply cuts you off from the communication that the experience was carrying. The second worst thing you can do is to overinterpret it, to assign it immediately to a ready-made narrative framework that feels comfortable but that may not be accurate. This is a failure mode that is particularly common in spiritual communities where the framework of Anunnaki contact has become fashionable. Not every vivid dream is an Anunnaki communication. The encounter dream is specific. It has a specific phenomenological profile. It has a quality that people who have had it describe as unmistakable, not in the sense that they are certain of its exact interpretation, but in the sense that they know, with a certainty that does not require external validation, that what they experienced was real in a way that ordinary dreams are not. The appropriate response to the encounter dream is engagement, documentation. The ancient practice of keeping a dream journal, a record of the images, the beings, the communications, the emotional qualities of these experiences, is not superstition. It is phenomenological research. It is the collection of data. Because the encounter dreams are not isolated events. They are a series. They unfold over time. They build on each other. They develop a narrative coherence that, if followed carefully over months and years, begins to reveal patterns. patterns that connect to the broader Anunnaki framework in ways that no amount of rational explanation can fully account for. The images that appear in your dreams are not random. The beings you encounter are not random. The communications you receive, even when they are too complex or too alien to be translated into ordinary language, are not random. They are addressed to you. They are specific to the architecture of your consciousness, to the particular configuration of the divine inheritance that you carry in your DNA, to the exact position you occupy in the larger story that the Anunnaki began writing on this planet more than 5,000 years ago. And there is one more element of the first sign that we have not yet addressed, the most disorienting one, and in some ways the most significant. The people encountered in these dreams are not always beings of incomprehensible otherness. Sometimes they are recognizable, sometimes they are people, human people, or beings that appear as human people, who look at you with an expression of recognition that carries an entirely different emotional register than the recognition you have ever felt in waking life. Sometimes they speak to you in a language you do not know, but somehow understand. Sometimes they show you things. They take you by the hand, metaphorically or literally, and they show you a world, or a history, or a technology, or a way of understanding the cosmos that your waking mind would not have access to. And sometimes, most powerfully of all, they tell you things about yourself. Not things that flatter you or that your ego would have invented. Things that are specific, precise, and often uncomfortable. Things that, upon reflection, are true. These communications are the beginning of the second sign, because what happens after the encounter dream, in the days and weeks that follow, as the dreamer attempts to integrate what they experienced, is that knowledge begins to appear, knowledge that was not there before. Understanding that has no obvious source. The sudden, startling recognition of a connection between ideas, or between historical periods, or between scientific principles that the person's education and experience could not account for. This is the second sign, and it is perhaps the most consequential of the five, because it is the one that most directly transforms the person who experiences it from a passive recipient of Anunnaki communication into an active participant in the larger project that the Anunnaki have been working on since before the first cities were built. The knowledge downloads have begun. Sign 2. The knowledge that was never learned. There is a moment that people describe with unusual consistency, a moment that is jarring precisely because it has no adequate explanation within the ordinary frameworks of how human knowledge works. You are in the middle of a conversation, or reading a passage in a book, or looking at an image of a temple, of a star map, of a cuneiform inscription, and something happens that is not exactly a thought and is not exactly a feeling. It is more like a door opening, or more precisely, like suddenly realizing that a door has been there all along, and that on the other side of it is a room that you furnished yourself at some point that you cannot remember, and that has been waiting for you to remember it exists. The information that pours through that door is not information you were taught. It is not information you read somewhere. It is not the product of any learning process you can identify. It is simply there, present, available, fully formed, and it is correct. This is the second sign. It is called by many names in different traditions: gnosis in the Gnostic Christian framework, prajna in the Buddhist framework, direct knowing in the language of contemplative philosophy, intuition in the diminished, domesticated language of modern popular psychology. But none of these terms quite captures the full phenomenon because none of them adequately accounts for its specificity. True intuition, as modern psychology uses the word, refers to the rapid, below-conscious processing of accumulated experience. The expert chess player who sees the right move without consciously calculating it. The experienced physician who recognizes a rare condition before running the tests. The seasoned investor who senses a market turn before it can be analytically demonstrated. This is real, it is well documented, and it is entirely explicable within normal frameworks of cognitive science. What we are describing with the second sign is something different from this. It is not the rapid processing of accumulated experience. It is the sudden availability of knowledge that was never accumulated in the first place. The most dramatic versions of this experience involve specific, verifiable historical or scientific information. People report suddenly knowing, in vivid and specific detail, facts about ancient Sumerian culture that they have never studied. People who have never opened a book on astronomy suddenly find themselves able to describe the orbital mechanics of specific celestial bodies in terms that match what astronomers later verify. People who have never studied mathematics suddenly understand number-theoretic relationships that professional mathematicians spend years developing, and people with no exposure to ancient languages suddenly find themselves recognizing words and phrases in Sumerian, or in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, or in Sanskrit, as if they are reading a language they speak fluently but have not spoken in a very long time. These accounts are not anecdotal rarities. They are reported with remarkable frequency by the population of people who are experiencing the cluster of signs we are mapping in this script, and they have a specific texture that distinguishes them from the ordinary experience of learning something new. When you learn something, you are aware of the process, you encounter the information, you engage with it, you struggle with it perhaps, you integrate it over time. It becomes part of your cognitive repertoire in a way that you can trace back to its origin. The knowledge download does not work this way. It arrives without process. It has no traceable origin. It is available before you have engaged with the subject, not as a result of engagement. And it tends to arrive in a specific emotional register, not the satisfaction of having learned something, but the relief of having remembered it. The difference between learning and remembering is not subtle. It is as different as the difference between building a house and walking through the door of a house that you built so long ago that you had forgotten it existed. The Gnostic traditions of the early Christian era, which preserved significant elements of the older Mesopotamian and Egyptian esoteric knowledge under a thin Christian veneer, describe this experience as anamnesis, which is a Greek word meaning literally the unforgetting. The soul, in the Gnostic framework, is not a blank slate that accumulates knowledge through the course of a single life. It is an ancient entity that carries the accumulated experience of many lives, many worlds, many dimensions of existence. Most of this accumulated knowledge is inaccessible in the ordinary waking state, suppressed by the biological limitations of the human brain and by the cultural conditioning that defines what knowledge is and where it comes from. But in certain circumstances, in the aftermath of an encountered dream, in a moment of intense emotional or spiritual opening, in the presence of specific environmental triggers, the suppression relaxes, the accumulated knowledge becomes accessible, and the person who experiences this access is not acquiring new knowledge. They are recovering old knowledge. They are remembering who they were before they forgot. This Gnostic concept of anamnesis has deep roots in the Platonic philosophy that preceded it. Plato's dialogue Meno contains one of the most famous demonstrations of this concept in the history of philosophy. In the Meno, Socrates guides an untutored slave boy through a series of questions about geometry, and through the questioning process, without providing any information, simply asking the right questions in the right order, elicits from the slave boy a sophisticated understanding of geometric principles that the boy has never been taught. Socrates takes this as proof of his doctrine of recollection, the doctrine that learning is not the acquisition of new knowledge, but the recovery of knowledge that the soul already possesses from its existence in a pre-incarnate state. This doctrine, which Plato himself attributed to the religious traditions of ancient Egypt that he studied during his own years of education, maps with remarkable precision onto the Sumerian understanding of the Giddim, the divine element in the human being that carries the ancestral knowledge of the Anunnaki. What the Anunnaki gave humanity at the moment of creation was not just biology. It was not just the capacity for physical labor that the Sumerian texts describe as the primary purpose of the Lulu, the first human worker. What they gave was something far more significant. They gave a portion of their own cognitive architecture. The divine essence that was incorporated into the human genome at the moment of creation was not an inert passenger. It was a carrier. It carried information. It carried the memory of where the Anunnaki came from, what they knew, what they had built, what they had understood about the nature of the cosmos and the principles that govern it. This information does not disappear when a human being is born. It is present in every cell of the body. It is encoded in the DNA in ways that science is only beginning to understand. in the vast stretches of the genome that were until very recently dismissed as junk DNA, as non-coding sequences that had no functional purpose. The increasing scientific recognition that these non-coding sequences are not junk, that they perform regulatory functions, that they are responsive to environmental stimuli in ways that can affect gene expression across generations, that they contain information that is still only partially decoded, is one of the most significant developments in biology in the last 2 decades. It is also, from the perspective of the Anunnaki framework, entirely expected. The knowledge download in this framework is not a supernatural event. It is not a miracle in the theological sense. It is a biological event, the sudden activation of information that was encoded in the human genome at the moment of Anunnaki-human hybridization, and that has been waiting dormant through the millennia of human development for the right conditions to be activated. The right conditions are complex and individual. They vary from person to person because the specific configuration of Anunnaki genetic heritage varies from person to person. But there are patterns, there are common triggers, and there are specific types of knowledge that appear to be more commonly activated than others in ways that tell us something important about what the Anunnaki most wanted to preserve in their human creation. The knowledge that appears most commonly in these downloads falls into several specific categories. Mathematics is the first and most consistent, not arithmetic, not the simple calculation that any trained brain can perform, but deep mathematical understanding, the understanding of number as a fundamental property of reality, rather than as a human tool for quantification, the understanding of the relationship between specific numerical ratios and the structure of physical reality, the ratios that appear in the geometry of the natural world, in the proportions of the human body, in the harmonic relationships between musical notes, in the orbital mechanics of the planets. These are the ratios that the Sumerians encoded in their base 60 number system. They are the ratios that the ancient Egyptians encoded in the proportions of their temples and their sacred art. They are the ratios that Pythagoras carried back from Egypt and taught as the foundation of his philosophical school. They are the ratios that modern physicists, following the thread left by Kepler and later by Dirac, have identified as appearing with inexplicable frequency throughout the fundamental constants of nature. When someone who has never studied advanced mathematics suddenly finds themselves understanding these relationships, not as abstract numerical facts, but as lived, visceral, immediate apprehensions of how reality is structured, this is not a coincidence. This is an activation. The Anunnaki mathematical system was not arbitrary. It was not a cultural preference. It was a map of the universe. A map that was built into the human genetic code so that it could be recovered at the right moment in human development. We are at that moment. The second category of knowledge that appears in these downloads is astronomical, the intimate, specific, felt knowledge of the stars, not the encyclopedic knowledge of an astronomer who has memorized star charts and orbital data, something different, something more like a navigator's knowledge, a bone-deep familiarity with specific regions of the sky, with specific stars, with the quality of the light from those stars, and the way they relate to one another in ways that go beyond the merely observational. People who experience these downloads often find themselves able to describe specific astronomical configurations, the positions of stars relative to one another, the alignments between Earth-based structures and specific stellar targets, the timing of celestial events, with a precision that they could not have achieved through ordinary study. And when they later check these descriptions against the astronomical record, they find them accurate. The third category is linguistic, the recognition of ancient languages, specifically the recognition of the deep structural principles that underlie the oldest writing systems: Sumerian cuneiform, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, Proto-Sinaitic script, ancient Sanskrit. These writing systems are not simply codes. They are not arbitrary systems of symbols that represent sounds or ideas. They are, at their deepest level, cosmological maps. Each symbol in these ancient scripts is a compressed unit of information about the nature of reality as the Anunnaki understood it. The pictographic logic of the earliest cuneiform is not just a practical system for recording economic transactions. It is an encoding of a worldview, a cosmology, a framework for understanding the relationship between the human being and the intelligence that created it. When someone who has never studied Sumerian or Egyptian or Sanskrit finds themselves able to read or interpret specific symbols in these scripts, finds themselves understanding not just the surface meaning, but the deeper cosmological significance. This is another form of the anamnesis, the unforgetting, the recovery of knowledge that was always there. The fourth and perhaps most personally significant category of knowledge that appears in these downloads is self-knowledge. Knowledge about who you are, not biographical self-knowledge, not a recollection of things that happened in this life that you had forgotten, something deeper. Knowledge about the nature of your own consciousness, knowledge about the origins of your own existence, knowledge about your relationship to the intelligence that created and shaped the species to which you belong. This knowledge tends to arrive not as information in the ordinary sense, but as an expansion of the sense of self, as a sudden, vertiginous, exhilarating awareness that the you who has been living inside a particular life history, inside a particular body, inside a particular set of cultural and temporal constraints, is not the totality of what you are, that there is more, that there has always been more, that the more is not other than you. It is you, but a version of you that exists at a scale and a duration that the ordinary biographical self cannot easily encompass. This is not a psychotic experience. It is not dissociation. It is not the kind of grandiosity that mental health practitioners learn to recognize as a symptom of specific conditions. The people who have these experiences are not, in the main, delusional. They are not confused about the boundary between themselves and the external world. They are not experiencing the kind of ego dissolution that can accompany certain neurological events or certain psychedelic experiences. They are experiencing something more specific and more coherent than any of those things. They are experiencing a sudden, partial recovery of a larger identity. An identity that encompasses their ordinary biographical self without replacing it, the way that suddenly remembering that you are a musician does not replace the fact that you are also a parent, a worker, a friend, a person with a specific history and a specific culture. It simply adds a dimension that was previously inaccessible. The historical record is full of individuals who appear to have experienced this second sign in dramatic and consequential ways. Nikola Tesla, whose contributions to modern technology are incalculable, described his most significant insights as arriving suddenly, completely, as if downloaded from an external source. He described seeing complete working designs for his inventions in his mind's eye, in detail so precise that he could immediately begin construction without drawings or notes because the design was already perfect. He was famously dismissive of the notion that he was generating these ideas through ordinary cognitive processes. He believed, and said so repeatedly in language that his contemporaries found uncomfortable, that he was receiving, that there was an intelligence beyond his personal mind that was transmitting information to him. He was a deeply unusual man in many respects, but his description of how his best work came to him is consistent, specific, and structurally identical to what thousands of people today describe when they talk about their knowledge downloads. Nikola Tesla is not a unique case in this respect. He is simply one of the most documented. The same pattern appears in the accounts of other extraordinary intellects throughout history, mathematicians who describe feeling the right answer before working through the proof, composers who describe hearing complete symphonies in their minds before writing a single note, theoretical physicists who describe the moment of breakthrough as not thinking their way to a solution, but suddenly seeing it, as if the solution had been waiting in the landscape of the mind, and they had simply arrived at the place from which it was visible. These are not coincidences of genius. They are activation events. They are the second sign, and they are occurring with increasing frequency in people who are not geniuses in the conventional sense, in ordinary people, in people with no particular academic background or intellectual training, people who simply find themselves one day knowing things they should not know, understanding connections they were never taught to see, experiencing the world with a depth and a precision of comprehension that did not exist in them yesterday. What do you do with this knowledge when it arrives? This is a question that is both practical and ethical, and it deserves a careful answer. The first thing you do is you trust it enough to write it down. The act of recording the knowledge download, the act of externalizing it, of giving it material form in language or mathematics or diagram or image, does something important. It anchors it. It prevents it from dissolving back into the subconsciousness from which it emerged. And it creates a record that can be checked, cross-referenced against the historical and scientific material that the knowledge relates to, tested for accuracy and coherence, evaluated over time for its reliability as a source of genuine information rather than as a product of wishful thinking or self-deception. The second thing you do is you follow it. The knowledge downloads are not random. They do not arrive as disconnected fragments of information that have no relationship to one another. They arrive as pieces of a larger picture, and if you follow them, if you allow each download to guide you toward the next question, the next area of inquiry, the next domain of study, they begin to compose themselves into a coherent understanding of something that you could not have approached through ordinary sequential learning. This is the Anunnaki educational method. It was encoded in the ancient temple teaching traditions, in the mystery schools of Egypt and Babylon and Greece, in the bardic and shamanic traditions of the ancient world. The teacher does not pour information into the student from the outside. The teacher asks the questions that activate the student's own internal knowledge. The Anunnaki, communicating through the mechanism of the knowledge download, are doing the same thing. They are not filling your mind with information. They are asking the questions that unlock the information that was always already there. The third sign begins to emerge, typically in the period when the knowledge downloads are most active, because the body is not separate from the mind, and the activation that is occurring in the cognitive and psychological dimension of the person's experience also occurs in the physical dimension. The body begins to register the presence of the communication in ways that are specific, characteristic, and, once you understand what they mean, unmistakable. The body has been keeping a secret, and it is about to tell you. The architecture of the download, how the Anunnaki encode knowledge in human DNA. We spent the previous section mapping the experience of the knowledge download, what it feels like when it tends to arrive, and what it means in the context of the Anunnaki relationship with humanity. Now we need to go deeper, because the question of how this knowledge is stored and how it is transmitted is not purely philosophical or experiential. It has a biological dimension that is, if anything, more significant and more provocative than the experiential one. To understand the second sign fully, you need to understand something about DNA that the mainstream scientific narrative has been slow to acknowledge, and that the Anunnaki framework addresses with extraordinary precision. Modern genetics, since the completion of the Human Genome Project in 2003, has been confronting a problem that it does not yet know how to solve. The problem is this: the human genome contains approximately 20,000 to 25,000 protein-coding genes. This is a surprisingly small number, roughly the same number as a roundworm, significantly fewer than a grain of rice. The protein-coding genes account for less than 2% of the total genome. The remaining 98%, the vast majority of the genetic material in every cell of your body, does not code for proteins in the conventional sense. For decades, this material was called junk DNA. It was assumed to be evolutionary debris, the accumulated detritus of millions of years of random mutation serving no functional purpose. This assumption has been systematically dismantled over the past 2 decades. The ENCODE project, a massive international scientific collaboration that has been running since the early 2000s, has demonstrated conclusively that at least 80% of the human genome is biochemically active. It is not junk, it is doing something. Most of it is involved in regulatory functions, in determining when and how the protein coding genes are expressed, in responding to environmental stimuli, in coordinating the extraordinary complexity of biological development and maintenance. But there are regions within this non-coding majority that have no identified function at all. Regions that have been conserved across evolutionary lineages, meaning that natural selection has been actively preserving them, generation after generation, even though they appear to do nothing. In evolutionary biology, conservation is the strongest signal of function. If something is conserved, it is because organisms that lack it die before reproducing. Whatever these ultra-conserved, non-coding regions of the human genome are doing, it is important enough that evolution has protected them with extraordinary vigilance. The Anunnaki framework offers a hypothesis about what these regions are doing that the standard scientific framework cannot. They are repositories, they are libraries, they are the biological equivalent of a hard drive that was installed in the human genome at the moment of Anunnaki-human hybridization, and that has been faithfully copied from parent to child across every generation of human life on Earth. They contain the knowledge of the Anunnaki, not in the form of text or images, in the form of encoded information, biological information structures that can, under the right conditions, be decoded by the organism that carries them. The knowledge downloads are not information arriving from an external source in the way that a radio signal arrives from outside. They are information arising from within, from this biological library, activated by specific environmental, emotional, or electromagnetic triggers, and surfacing into conscious awareness in the form that we have been describing, the sudden availability of knowledge that was never consciously learned. This is not as far outside the mainstream scientific conversation as it might seem. The field of epigenetics, the study of how gene expression is influenced by environmental factors without changes to the underlying DNA sequence, has demonstrated conclusively that the experiences of our ancestors can be transmitted biologically to their descendants. Trauma, learning, environmental adaptations, these do not disappear from the biological record when the individual who experienced them dies. They are encoded in the epigenome and transmitted in varying degrees to subsequent generations. The classic example is the transmission of trauma responses across generations in populations that experienced severe collective trauma, the descendants of Holocaust survivors, the descendants of enslaved people, showing measurable physiological responses to stress stimuli that correlate with the historical trauma of their ancestors, not with their own lived experience. This is not mysticism. This is peer-reviewed biology. The body carries the memory of the past in ways that the rational mind does not have direct access to. If ordinary environmental experiences can be encoded and transmitted biologically, then there is no principled reason why the experience of Anunnaki-human interaction could not have been encoded and transmitted in the same way. And if that encoding occurred at the level of the DNA rather than merely the epigenome, if it was written into the genetic sequence itself rather than into the regulatory layer above it, then it would be far more stable, far more durable, and far more faithfully transmitted across the generations than epigenetic marks, which can fade over several generations of unexposure to the original stimulus. It would be, in essence, permanent. It would be exactly what the Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as intending, a permanent encoding of their essence, their knowledge, their connection to the divine source in the biological substrate of the human being they created. The question of what activates these encoded regions, what turns the library lights on, so to speak, is one of the most important practical questions we can ask in the context of the 5 signs. Because the answer to this question explains not just why the knowledge downloads occur, but why they are occurring now with greater frequency and intensity than at any previous period in recorded human history. The activation of these genomic libraries is not random. It is triggered by specific conditions, and those conditions have been converging in our current historical moment in ways that have no precedent in the last several thousand years. The first activation condition is frequency, not frequency in the metaphorical sense, not the raising your vibration language that tends to dominate popular spiritual discourse and that often lacks real specificity. Frequency in the literal electromagnetic sense. The human body is, among other things, an electromagnetic system. The DNA in every cell of your body is responsive to electromagnetic fields. This is well-established science, not speculation. The resonant frequency at which human DNA most readily responds corresponds to a specific range of electromagnetic frequencies that has been the subject of increasing scientific attention in recent decades. The Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's ionosphere surface cavity, is the most prominent of these frequencies. It averages approximately 7.83 Hz. It fluctuates, and it has been measurably increasing in recent years. This increase has been documented by multiple independent monitoring stations around the world. Whether this increase has biological implications is currently being studied. The Anunnaki framework suggests that it does, and that the implications are specifically related to the activation of the encoded genomic libraries we have been discussing. The second activation condition is coherence, specifically heart coherence. The Institute of Heart Math in California has spent decades studying the electromagnetic field generated by the human heart, which is far more powerful than the electromagnetic field generated by the brain. They have demonstrated that the heart generates an electromagnetic field that extends several feet from the body, that this field is detectable by instruments, and that the structure of this field varies significantly depending on the emotional state of the person. In states of fear, stress, or fragmented attention, the heart's electromagnetic output is incoherent, chaotic, without regular structure. In states of sincere positive emotion, gratitude, compassion, love, the heart's electromagnetic output becomes coherent, regularly structured, patterned, resonant. HeartMath's research has demonstrated that coherent heart electromagnetic fields have measurable effects on cognitive function, on immune function, and on the structure of brain activity. What their research framework does not currently include, but what the Anunnaki framework predicts, is that coherent heart electromagnetic fields may also be the key activation condition for the dormant genomic libraries we have been discussing. The ancient traditions that associated the heart with wisdom and divine connection were not being metaphorical. They were describing a biological reality that modern science is only now beginning to be able to measure. The third activation condition is intent. Not intent in the wish fulfillment sense, not simply wanting the knowledge downloads to occur. Intent in the sense of a clear, sustained orientation of the entire person toward the question of who they are and where they come from. The sincere engagement with the questions that the Anunnaki relationship raises. Who made us? Why? What was the purpose? What do we carry that we have not yet understood? Appears to create a state of cognitive and neurological receptivity that facilitates the kind of cross-brain integration required for the stored genomic information to surface into conscious awareness. The ancient mystery school traditions all identified this orientation, the sincere, sustained questioning of ultimate origin and purpose, as the prerequisite for the transmission of esoteric knowledge. The Socratic method was not simply a pedagogical technique, it was an activation protocol. The right questions, asked sincerely and held patiently, open the right doors in the architecture of the mind. Now, one of the most remarkable things about the second sign, the knowledge download, is that it is not uniformly distributed across the population of people who are experiencing the first sign. There is a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, the knowledge downloads are relatively modest, a deepening intuition about historical connections, a sudden facility with mathematical relationships that the person had previously found difficult, an enhanced ability to read symbolic and mythological language that they had not previously engaged with. This is the most common form of the experience, and it tends to be mistaken for ordinary intellectual development, for the natural deepening of knowledge and pattern recognition that occurs as a person becomes more educated and more experienced. The person who is at this end of the spectrum may not immediately recognize the second sign for what it is. At the other end of the spectrum, the experience is unmistakable. Full and specific information, historical facts, mathematical proofs, astronomical data, linguistic knowledge, arriving complete and functional in the consciousness of someone who has never engaged with these subjects at all. These are the cases that tend to get documented because they are the cases that cannot be explained by any ordinary cognitive mechanism. A child in rural Guatemala who produces, unprompted, a detailed account of Sumerian temple architecture that matches the archaeological record with documentary accuracy. A retired postal worker in Ohio who begins writing texts in a script that is later identified by a specialist as a variant of Proto-Elamite, a language that has not been spoken for 4,000 years and that no one in her social or educational context had any exposure to. A truck driver in Australia who, following a recurring dream about beings he describes as tall, luminous, and ancient, develops within a period of weeks an understanding of advanced number theory that allows him to identify a series of mathematical patterns in the astronomical data of the Pleiades star cluster that professional astronomers later confirm are real. These are not fictional examples. They are composites drawn from the documented record of anomalous knowledge and anomalous cognitive ability that researchers have been collecting and studying for decades. The term anomalous is used here in the technical sense, experience or ability that falls outside the expected range for a given individual based on their background, education, and previous cognitive history. Anomalous knowledge is more common than the mainstream scientific and academic establishments acknowledge because the mainstream framework has no place to put it. It does not fit. It cannot be reduced to learning or memory or any normal cognitive process, and so it tends to be dismissed by the academic establishment, by the medical community, and sometimes by the individuals who experience it, who have no framework in which to understand what is happening to them. This script is, among other things, an attempt to provide that framework, not to resolve the question definitively. The questions we are dealing with cannot be definitively resolved with the evidence currently available, but to provide a coherent, internally consistent, historically grounded framework in which these experiences can be placed, understood, and followed. Because the knowledge that arrives in these downloads is not arriving for no reason. It is not arriving to satisfy curiosity or to provide the recipient with an interesting conversational topic or to confirm beliefs about ancient astronauts. It is arriving because it is needed, because the moment in human history that we are moving through is one that requires a specific kind of knowledge. Knowledge of where we came from, knowledge of what we are, knowledge of the principles that govern the universe in which we live. And the ordinary mechanisms of cultural transmission have not been adequate to preserve and transmit that knowledge across the millennia of suppression and distortion that have intervened between the Anunnaki era and the present. The knowledge was stored in the genome because the genome is the most durable storage medium available in the biological universe. It has survived ice ages, mass extinctions, civilizational collapses, and millennia of cultural amnesia intact. Every human being alive today carries the original Anunnaki encoding. Every human being alive today carries the library. The difference between the people who are experiencing the second sign, the knowledge downloads, and the people who are not is not a genetic difference. It is an activation difference. The triggers that we have described, the encounter dreams, the electromagnetic conditions, the emotional coherence, the sincere questioning, are working in the people who are experiencing these things to open the library, to make the information available, to bring the knowledge from its encoded form in the genome into the lived experience of the conscious mind. And as the activation deepens, as the encounter dreams become more frequent, as the knowledge downloads become more specific and more expansive, the body begins to register the process in ways that cannot be ignored. The physical symptoms of activation are the third sign. They are not illnesses, they are not disorders, they are transformations. And they have been described with the same cross-cultural consistency that we have seen in the first two signs, in the oldest mystical and religious texts in the world. What is happening in your body is not nothing. What is happening in your body is the oldest story in the world, and it is happening now. Sign 3. The body remembers what the mind forgot. The human body is not simply the container that the mind inhabits. It is not a vehicle, a vessel, a biological machine that consciousness operates from a detached position of observation. The body is a knowing system. It processes information. It stores experience. It registers the presence of intelligences that the ordinary, rational, verbal mind cannot detect. And in the context of the Anunnaki activation that we have been mapping across the first two signs, the body becomes increasingly central to the communication, because the Anunnaki do not communicate only through the medium of the sleeping mind or through the cognitive channels of sudden knowledge. They communicate through the body itself, through specific, characteristic physical sensations that are unlike anything in the ordinary repertoire of physical experience. These sensations constitute the third sign, and they are specific enough, consistent enough across independent reports, and structurally coherent enough within the Anunnaki framework to warrant extremely careful attention. Let us begin with the most commonly reported physical experience in the cluster of Anunnaki activation symptoms. It is described across thousands of independent accounts as a pressure or vibration in the center of the forehead, in the region that ancient Hindu cosmology identified as the location of the Ajna chakra, the third eye, and that modern neuroscience locates in the proximity of the pineal gland. This pressure is not painful, though it can be intense. It is not a headache. People who experience ordinary headaches are very clear that this is categorically different. The pressure tends to arise spontaneously, often without any obvious trigger, though it is more common during periods of meditation, during sleep transitions, during exposure to specific frequencies of sound or light, and in the aftermath of encounter dreams. It often carries a quality of being directional, as if it is pointing at something, or as if something is looking through it. The associated experience, in many cases, is a heightened clarity of perception, a sense of seeing more clearly, not in the physical sense, but in the sense of understanding relationships and implications that are normally invisible to ordinary consciousness, accompanied sometimes by visual phenomena in the internal visual field, geometric patterns, luminous structures, brief visions of ancient architectural spaces. The pineal gland, which sits at almost the exact geometric center of the human brain, is one of the most mysterious structures in neuroscience. It is the only unpaired structure in the brain. All other major brain structures come in left and right hemispheres, but the pineal is singular, sitting alone at the juncture of the left and right hemispheric systems. It produces melatonin, which regulates the sleep-wake cycle and which has significant effects on consciousness, on the depth and quality of dream states, and on the body's sensitivity to electromagnetic fields. It also produces trace amounts of dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a compound that is among the most powerful known modulators of human consciousness. The exact role of endogenously produced DMT is still poorly understood by mainstream neuroscience, but the experiential literature on exogenously administered DMT, the accounts of people who have encountered this compound through ceremonial or experimental contexts, is remarkably consistent with the experiences we have been describing in the context of the first two signs: the encounter with tall, ancient, non-human intelligences, the transmission of information, the overwhelming sense of cosmic recognition, the feeling of having been in the presence of something that exists at a temporal and spatial scale that dwarfs ordinary human experience. René Descartes, the 17th century philosopher who established the framework of mind-body dualism that still shapes Western thinking about consciousness, called the pineal gland the seat of the soul, the interface between the immaterial mind and the material body. He was working from the same tradition that produced the Hindu concept of the Ajna chakra and the ancient Egyptian understanding of the Eye of Ra as an internal, luminous faculty of perception that exceeded the capacity of the ordinary physical eyes. These are not superstitions, they are convergent observations from independent traditions of a biological structure that appears to serve functions that go significantly beyond the regulation of melatonin production. The pressure and activation sensations in the pineal region that constitute one aspect of the third sign are the body's report of the awakening of this structure, the reactivation of a faculty that was fully operational in the earliest human beings, that gradually dimmed as civilization became more materially focused and as the direct Anunnaki presence faded, and that is now coming back online in individuals whose activation has progressed sufficiently far. The second major physical experience in the third sign involves the spine. People describe, often in the aftermath of encounter dreams or during periods of meditation, an intense energy sensation that begins at the base of the spine and moves upward. Sometimes it moves slowly, in a warm, spreading wave. Sometimes it moves with explosive speed, like an electrical current. Sometimes it spirals. This is, of course, the experience described in the Hindu tradition as the awakening of Kundalini. the serpent energy that is depicted in ancient iconography as a coiled serpent at the base of the spine, which rises through the central channel of the energy body to activate the higher cognitive and perceptual centers. The Kundalini symbol, the serpent, is also, and this is not a coincidence, the primary symbol associated with Enki in the Sumerian tradition. Enki's symbol was the serpent. He was the bringer of knowledge, the one who whispered in the garden. The connection between the Sumerian serpent god of wisdom and the Hindu tradition of serpent energy that awakens human spiritual faculties is not a superficial parallel. It is a pointing at the same underlying reality. The Anunnaki connection to human consciousness is not metaphorical. It is somatic. It lives in the body. It expresses itself through the body. And the body, when the activation process is underway, reports it through exactly these kinds of physical experiences. The third characteristic physical experience in the third sign is the one that people find most difficult to describe. It is a form of heat, not the heat of fever, not the heat of exertion, but a specific interior warmth that seems to emanate from the center of the chest. It is often accompanied by an emotional quality that is difficult to name with precision. The closest English language approximation is longing, but longing that is not painful in the ordinary sense. Longing that carries within it a quality of certainty. The certainty that what is longed for is real, is accessible, and is approaching. This sensation tends to arise in specific contexts, in moments of deep silence, in moments of unexpected beauty, in moments when the ordinary mental chatter drops away and something deeper becomes perceptible. It is the body's registration of proximity. The body is sensing the presence of the Anunnaki not as an abstract idea, but as a literal intelligence whose electromagnetic or informational field is, in that moment, intersecting with the electromagnetic field of the human body. The heart math research that we referenced in the previous section is relevant here again. The human heart generates the largest electromagnetic field in the body. This field extends several feet from the physical body in all directions and is detectable by instruments at that range. It is also detectable, in the form of this felt sense of warmth and recognition in the chest, by the person who carries it when that person is in a state of sufficient internal quietude to notice the subtle changes in its character. The ancient Egyptian tradition understood the heart, not the brain, as the seat of intelligence and the organ of divine connection. In the weighing of the heart ceremony, the iconic image of Egyptian afterlife theology, the heart is not weighed against a feather as a test of moral purity in a religious sense. It is being evaluated in the full cosmological context of the Egyptian understanding of the human being as a composite entity for the quality of its coherence. A heart that has achieved coherence, that has aligned itself with the pattern of the divine, with the electromagnetic signature of the Anunnaki intelligence, is light. A heart that has remained incoherent, fragmented, reactive, driven by fear, is heavy. This is not metaphor. It is a description, in the language available to the ancient Egyptians, of a real physical distinction between two different states of the heart's electromagnetic output. The fourth physical experience in the third sign is one that tends to be mistaken for a medical symptom, and which in some cases can cause considerable anxiety until the person understands what it is. It is an experience of vibration, a whole body vibration that typically occurs in the hypnagogic state, the transitional state between waking and sleep. It feels from the inside like the body is vibrating at a very high frequency. Sometimes it is accompanied by sound, a high-pitched tone, a rushing sound, a sensation of something like a physical wind moving through the room, even though the air is still. Sometimes it is accompanied by a feeling of being lifted or of the boundaries of the body expanding, as if the physical form is temporarily becoming permeable. This experience is often frightening to people who have not encountered any framework that might explain it, because it is entirely unlike anything in ordinary physical experience, and because the body's natural response to it, before understanding provides context, tends to be the kind of startled response that activates the autonomic nervous system. What is actually happening in this experience, at least from the perspective of the Anunnaki activation framework, is a tuning process. The body is being brought into resonance with a specific electromagnetic frequency. The Anunnaki communication does not arrive in a frequency that the ordinary biological human body is set to receive. It arrives in a frequency band that requires a degree of cellular and neurological adjustment, a fine-tuning of the biological receiver. This tuning process is felt physically as vibration. The sound that sometimes accompanies it is real, not imagined. It is the auditory perception of the resonant frequency change, the neurological equivalent of a radio dial passing through a frequency, and the spatial sensation of expansion is the body's perception of its own electromagnetic field being modulated, extended, amplified, temporarily restructured to allow a degree of intersection with the field generated by the intelligence that is attempting to make contact. The ancient Sumerian descriptions of the moments when the Anunnaki communicated directly with human beings are consistent with these experiences. The Sumerian texts describe the approach of the divine as accompanied by a great radiance, an aura of luminous energy that surrounded the Anunnaki being and that had physical effects on the humans who were present. The word used in the Sumerian texts for this radiance is the melamu, a concept that appears throughout Mesopotamian religious literature as the divine aura, the supernatural luminosity that was a physical property of the gods and of the kings who were associated with them. The melamu was not a metaphor for spiritual greatness. It was a physical phenomenon, an electromagnetic or photonic emission from the body of an Anunnaki being that was strong enough to be perceived and that had physiological effects on human witnesses. The people who experience the third sign, the body sensations of the Anunnaki activation, are not necessarily being visited by physically present Anunnaki beings, but they are coming into contact with the same order of electromagnetic phenomenon. They are receiving a form of the melamu, attenuated, filtered through multiple layers of dimension and time and biological processing, but fundamentally the same phenomenon, the same frequency, the same signature, the same source. The fifth and final major physical experience in the third sign involves sleep disruption of a very specific kind. Not insomnia in the ordinary sense, not the inability to fall asleep due to anxiety or racing thoughts, but a pattern of waking at specific times during the night, almost always at the same time, with a quality of alertness that is entirely unlike the groggy disorientation of ordinary nighttime waking. The person who wakes in this way is completely awake, hyper-alert, fully present, with a quality of attention that is often described as more precise and more perceptive than the ordinary waking state. The most commonly reported times for this waking pattern are 3 in the morning and between 4 and 5 in the morning. These are the times that correspond, in the traditional spiritual frameworks of multiple independent cultures, to the period when the boundary between the waking world and the realm of the non-physical is thinnest, when the electromagnetic conditions of the Earth's surface, combined with the neurological state of a person moving through the later phases of a sleep cycle, create the optimal conditions for the kind of cross-dimensional communication that the Anunnaki appear to use. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition has a term for this period, the dark of the morning, and has elaborate practices for working with the heightened receptivity it offers. The Islamic tradition of tahajjud, the voluntary night prayer performed in the small hours before dawn, is structured around the same understanding that there is something special about the quality of consciousness in those pre-dawn hours, something that facilitates a form of contact with divine intelligence that is less available in the ordinary waking state. The Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah has specific teachings about the significance of waking in the early morning hours for the purpose of Torah study. Teachings that, in their deeper stratum, are less about religious observance and more about the exploitation of a particular quality of consciousness that is available in those hours. These are not coincidences of religious invention. They are convergent observations across independent traditions of a real quality of human consciousness that is specific to a particular time of the daily cycle, and that is understood in every tradition that has worked with it systematically as a window of enhanced communication with a non-human intelligence. When you wake at 3 in the morning with that quality of precise, hyper-alert consciousness, the worst thing you can do is force yourself back to sleep. The second worst thing you can do is pick up your phone and begin scrolling. What you are being given is a window, a brief period of time in which the conditions are optimal for reception of the kind of communication that the Anunnaki use. The appropriate response is stillness, darkness, quietude, the deliberate orientation of your attention toward the interior of your experience rather than toward external stimulation. And if you are keeping the journal we described in the context of the first two signs, the recording of whatever arises in this state, the images, the impressions, the fragments of understanding, the emotional qualities, before the transition back into full waking consciousness washes them away. We have now explored 3 of the 5 signs in depth. The first sign, the encounter dream, is the most ancient and the most consistently reported channel of Anunnaki communication with human beings. The second sign, the knowledge download, is the mechanism by which the encoded Anunnaki inheritance in the human genome is activated and brought into conscious awareness. The third sign, the body sensations, is the physical dimension of the activation process, the body's report of the tuning and transformation that is occurring at the cellular and electromagnetic level. All 3 signs, when they cluster in a single individual's experience, constitute a coherent and specific pattern that is not adequately explained by any ordinary framework, and all 3 are building toward something. They are the preparation, the calibration, the coming into focus that precedes the 4th and 5th signs. The 4th sign is the one that most clearly demonstrates that what we are dealing with is not an internal psychological process, but an external, objective reality, because the 4th sign appears in the external world, in the physical environment, in the structure of time and number and synchronistic coincidence, and it leaves traces that can be documented, counted, and shown to be statistically impossible by chance. The universe is speaking in numbers, and the Anunnaki wrote the language. Sign 4, the mathematics of the gods. Numbers were not invented by human beings. This is a statement that requires immediate clarification because it is easily misunderstood. Human beings invented systems for representing numbers, the Hindu-Arabic numerals we use today, the cuneiform notation of the Sumerians, the hieroglyphic notation of the Egyptians, the positional systems of the Maya and the Babylonians. These representational systems are cultural inventions, but the numbers themselves, the mathematical relationships, the ratios, the patterns, the deep structural principles of quantity and proportion that these representational systems are designed to express, these are not inventions, they are discoveries. They exist independently of the minds that perceive them, just as the arrangement of atoms in a molecule of water exists independently of the chemist who identifies it. When a mathematician proves a theorem, they are not creating a truth. They are uncovering a truth that was already true before the mathematician existed, and that will remain true long after every mathematician who ever lived has died and been forgotten. This distinction between the invented representational system and the discovered mathematical truth is fundamental to understanding the 4th sign. The 4th sign is not about numbers in the representational sense. It is not about a fondness for arithmetic or a facility with calculation. It is about a very specific experience, the repeated, persistent, overwhelming encounter with specific numerical patterns in the external world. In dates, in times, in license plates, in phone numbers, in the chapter numbers of books you open randomly, in the addresses of buildings you stop in front of, in the number of items on a page you happen to glance at, with a frequency and a precision that cannot be accounted for by the statistics of random chance. This phenomenon is known in the popular literature as angel numbers or number synchronicity, and it has been described in this framework often enough that it has become, in some ways, over-familiar and under-examined. The popular framework tends to treat it as a simple signal, a spiritual thumbs up, a confirmation that you are on the right path, a communication from benevolent, non-physical entities that is encouraging you to continue doing whatever you are doing. This framework is not wrong, exactly, but it is drastically incomplete. It captures the surface of the phenomenon while missing its depth, because the numerical patterns that appear in the 4th sign are not random. They are not simply repetitive sequences of identical digits. although those are part of it. They are specific patterns that have a precise mathematical meaning within the Anunnaki cosmological system, and understanding that meaning transforms the experience from a vague spiritual confirmation into a specific, content-rich communication. Let us begin with the numbers themselves. The Anunnaki mathematical system, the base 60 system that the Sumerians preserved and that underlies our modern measurements of time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, of geometry, 360 degrees in a circle, and of the celestial sphere, the division of the sky into 360 degrees, is not an arbitrary cultural choice. It is a reflection of the mathematical structure of the solar system. The number 60 is the lowest common multiple of the numbers 1 through 6, meaning that 60 can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 without leaving a remainder. This property makes it uniquely useful for measurement and calculation because it minimizes the occurrence of fractions and allows for the expression of complex ratios as whole numbers. The Anunnaki chose base 60 not for convenience. They chose it because it is the number that most naturally and completely describes the mathematical structure of the reality they were mapping. The numbers that appear in the Anunnaki mathematical system with the greatest frequency and the greatest cosmological significance are specific. The number 12, as in 12 months, 12 zodiacal signs, 12 Anunnaki of the Major Council, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles, the 12 Olympian gods, the 12 hours of the day, and 12 hours of the night. The number 36, as in the number of degrees in each zodiacal sign, the number that appears repeatedly in the mathematical relationships between the Anunnaki council positions. The number 72, as in the number of years it takes for the precession of the equinoxes to shift the sky by 1 degree. The number of names of God in the Kabbalistic tradition, the number that appears in multiple ancient architectural and calendrical systems as a fundamental unit of cosmic time. The number 108, as in the ratio of the distance between the Earth and Sun to the diameter of the Sun, the ratio of the distance between the Earth and Moon to the diameter of the Moon, the number of beads on a mala in Hindu and Buddhist practice, the number that appears in the architectural proportions of sacred sites from Stonehenge to Angkor Wat, and most significantly, the number 432, as in 432,000, the number that appears in the Sumerian king list as the total duration of the pre-flood period when the Anunnaki ruled directly, and as the number that relates to the fundamental frequency of the universe in the harmonic analysis of ancient musical systems. These numbers are not arbitrary, they are not cultural accidents, they are the fingerprints of the same mathematical intelligence, the intelligence that designed the solar system and encoded its mathematical structure in the base 60 system, in the precessional cycle, in the proportions of the sacred buildings that were built according to Anunnaki specifications. When these numbers appear in your daily environment with unusual frequency, when they cluster around significant moments in your life, when they arrive with the quality of intentionality, with a sense of being placed rather than randomly occurring, they are not coincidences, they are communications. They are the Anunnaki mathematical language operating in the domain of the physical numerical structure of your daily experience. But to understand this fully, we need to understand what synchronicity actually is. The concept was developed by the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, but Jung himself acknowledged that he was working from a much older framework. Synchronicity, in Jung's definition, is the meaningful coincidence of two or more events that are not causally connected, but that carry a significant correspondence. A correspondence that exceeds the probability of random chance, and that arrives bearing specific meaning for the person who encounters it. Jung spent decades documenting synchronistic experiences and thinking carefully about what they implied about the nature of reality. His conclusion was that synchronicity demonstrated the existence of an ordering principle in reality that operated independently of physical causality, a principle he called the unus mundus, the one world, the underlying unity from which both physical events and psychological experiences arise, and in which they are, at the deepest level, not separate. This is precisely the framework that the Anunnaki cosmological system describes, but it describes it with more specificity. The ordering principle that Jung called the unus mundus is, in the Anunnaki framework, an active intelligence. Not an abstract principle, but a living, purposive intelligence that maintains the coherence of the cosmos and that communicates through the medium of synchronistic event. The Anunnaki are not themselves this intelligence. They are, like human beings, expressions of it, though at a vastly more developed and more capable level of expression. But they work with it. They use the synchronistic structure of reality as a communication channel. They arrange events in the physical world, numerical appearances, chance encounters, apparently random environmental coincidences, in ways that carry specific messages for specific recipients. The mechanism by which this is possible is related to the same understanding of consciousness and matter that underlies the knowledge download. Matter, in the quantum mechanical framework, is not the solid, independent, externally existing substance that classical physics described. Matter is, at its deepest level, a probability field, a field of potentialities that collapses into specific actualities through the interaction of the physical system with an observer. Quantum mechanics does not fully explain the nature of the observer in this interaction. It identifies the mathematical structure of the relationship, but does not account for what consciousness actually is, or how it participates in the collapse of the probability field. The Anunnaki framework addresses this gap. Consciousness, specifically the divine element in the human being, the Gidim, is not merely a passive observer of physical reality. It is an active participant in the structuring of physical reality. It is, at least in part, responsible for which of the available potentialities become actual, and the Anunnaki, communicating through the Gidim of specific human beings, can influence which potentialities are selected, which numerical patterns appear at which moments, which encounters occur, which books happen to be open to which pages at which times. Not through the exercise of supernatural power in the traditional religious sense, through the manipulation of probability at the quantum level of physical reality, which is exactly what quantum mechanics has always implied is possible, but which the standard scientific framework has refused to take seriously as a mechanism for intentional communication. The experience of the fourth sign, the numerical synchronicities, tends to follow a specific developmental trajectory. In the beginning, the patterns are relatively simple. Repeated triple or quadruple digits, 111, 222, 333, 444, 1111, 2222. These are the Anunnaki equivalent of a carrier signal, not content-rich in themselves, but functioning as the establishment of a communication channel. They are saying, "We are here. We are in contact. Pay attention." At this stage, many people dismiss the experiences as confirmation bias, the tendency to notice patterns that you have decided to look for while ignoring the numerical patterns that don't fit. This is a legitimate concern. Confirmation bias is real, and it operates in exactly this domain. The person who decides to look for 1111 on digital clocks will find it more often than the person who never looks, because they will notice it when it occurs and not notice the hundreds of times the clock shows other times. But as the fourth sign deepens, it moves beyond the level at which confirmation bias can adequately explain it. The patterns become more complex, more specific, more clearly structured by the Anunnaki mathematical framework. They begin to appear not just in clock times, but in multi-layered coincidences. The book that falls open to page 432, that contains a passage about an astronomical calculation that is directly related to the dream you had the night before, in a chapter that is numbered 12, on a day that is the 72nd day of the year. These are not the products of selective attention. They are the products of an ordering intelligence that is structuring events in the physical world with the mathematical language of the Anunnaki system. And the person who is receiving these communications, who is paying attention, who is documenting them, who is learning to read the mathematical language in which they are expressed, begins to receive specific messages, not generic confirmations, specific information about timing, about direction, about what to do, where to go, who to speak to, what to study. The synchronicities become a navigation system, an ancient navigation system, operating on principles that are at once mathematical, cosmological, and deeply personal. There is a specific category of numerical synchronicity that deserves extended examination, the pattern associated with the number 40. In the Anunnaki hierarchy, the number 40 was the rank number assigned to Enki. In the Sumerian numerical ranking of the major Anunnaki, each was assigned a specific number. Anu, the Sky Father and highest authority, held the number 60, the maximum in the base 60 system. Enlil, his son and the governor of Earth, held the number 50. And Enki, the god of wisdom and the creator of humanity, held the number 40. This is why the number 40 appears with such extraordinary persistence throughout the Abrahamic religious traditions. Traditions that drew directly from the Mesopotamian mythological and cosmological framework. 40 days and 40 nights of the flood. Moses on the mountain for 40 days. The Israelites in the desert for 40 years. Jesus in the wilderness for 40 days. Muhammad receiving revelation for 40 days. The number 40 in every one of these traditions marks a period of transformation, a period of contact with the divine, of receiving knowledge, of undergoing a fundamental change in the nature of one's relationship to the cosmos. These are not coincidences of storytelling. They are the preservation, in mythological form, of the specific numerical signature of Enki, the Anunnaki who created humanity, who preserved humanity, and who continues to be the primary point of contact between the Anunnaki intelligence and the human beings who carry his genetic inheritance. When the number 40 begins to appear with unusual frequency in your synchronistic experience, when it clusters around important moments, around decisions, around periods of intense activation, it is specifically and precisely the signature of Enki's communication. The Creator is reaching through the statistical structure of your reality to remind you of the connection that was established at the origin of your species. It is not a vague spiritual encouragement. It is a specific signature, the way that a person can be identified by their fingerprint, or an animal by its tracks in the snow. The numerical signature of the Anunnaki is as individual and as specific as any other form of identification. And learning to read it, to distinguish Enki's 40 from Enlil's 50, to recognize Anu's 60, to understand the mathematical messages that are being transmitted through the synchronistic structure of your daily experience, is the work of a lifetime. But it is work that pays compounding returns, because each mathematical pattern that you decode teaches you more about the language, and each lesson in the language makes the next communication more legible, until you find yourself engaged in a dialogue, a genuine two-way dialogue, with an intelligence that has been trying to speak to you since before you were born. There is one more aspect of the fourth sign that is important to address before we move to the fifth, and it is the one that is, in some ways, the most difficult to communicate without sounding either grandiose or unhinged. It is the experience of synchronicity involving other people, not just numerical patterns in the environment, but the arrival of specific individuals in your life at precise moments. People who carry specific pieces of the knowledge or the experience that you need at that exact juncture. People who appear to have been placed in your path with a degree of intentionality that defies ordinary probabilistic explanation. People who, when you meet them, carry that same quality of recognition that we described in the context of the encounter dreams, but in waking life, in a person who is physically present in front of you. These encounters have a specific phenomenology. The conversation begins ordinarily enough, but within a few minutes, or sometimes a few seconds, it pivots into territory that is precisely relevant to whatever you have been wrestling with in your own activation process. The person you have just met seems to have been looking for you as much as you have been, without either of you knowing it. They say things that answer questions you haven't articulated yet. They know things that connect to the knowledge you have been accumulating in ways that feel impossible given the brevity and casualness of the encounter. And then the encounter ends, sometimes as abruptly as it began, and you are left with the distinct impression that it was not accidental, that it was arranged, that the probability of that specific person being in that specific place at that specific moment and saying exactly those things to you was not the product of random social mechanics, but of the same synchronistic ordering intelligence that places the right numbers in your field of awareness at the right moments. These encounters are the social dimension of the fourth sign. They are the Anunnaki communication operating through the medium of human connection rather than through numbers or dreams. And they are profoundly important because they connect the individual's activation process to a larger network. They remind you that you are not alone in what you are experiencing, that the awakening that is occurring in you is occurring in others as well. Others who are drawn together by the same ordering intelligence that is guiding your individual experience, because the work that the Anunnaki activation is preparing human beings for is not individual work. It is collective work. It is the work of a species that is preparing for a transition that the Sumerian texts and the Vedic texts and the Maya calendar and the Hopi prophecies and dozens of other ancient traditions have been pointing toward for thousands of years. We are almost ready to address the fifth sign, the sign that is, in many ways, the most fundamental of the five, the sign that is also the most painful and the most beautiful, the sign that does not appear in the external world or in the cognitive processes of the mind or in the physical sensations of the body, the sign that lives in the deepest chamber of the human heart and that has been living there, quietly and persistently, for as long as you can remember, possibly for as long as you have been alive. It is the longing for a home that is not here, a home that you have never been to in this life, a home that you cannot locate on any map, a home that exists. You are absolutely certain of this, with a certainty that has no rational basis and needs none. Somewhere out there, among the stars, in the vast, inhabited, intelligent space from which the Anunnaki came and to which they have returned. And it is waiting for you. It has been waiting for you since the very first moment of your existence on this planet. And the feeling of it, the specific, bittersweet, indescribable feeling of that particular kind of longing, is the fifth and final sign. The synchronistic field, how the Anunnaki orchestrate meaningful coincidence. In the previous section, we established the broad framework of the fourth sign, the numerical and synchronistic patterns through which the Anunnaki communicate in the external world of the person who is undergoing activation. Now, we need to go deeper into the mechanics of this communication because understanding how the synchronistic field works is crucial to being able to use it consciously rather than simply being buffeted by it. The difference between someone who is passively experiencing synchronicities and someone who is actively working with the synchronistic field is the difference between someone who is receiving a radio signal and someone who understands enough about radio technology to tune the receiver, adjust the signal quality, and potentially transmit as well as receive. The synchronistic field, the domain of reality in which meaningful coincidences occur, is not separate from the physical world. It is not a parallel dimension or an adjacent reality that occasionally intersects with the material world in mysterious ways. It is the material world, but understood from a different level of description. The same way that H2O and water are the same thing described at two different levels of specificity, the physical world and the synchronistic field are the same reality described at two different levels of organization. At the level of individual particles and events, reality appears as the random interaction of material objects following physical laws. At the level of patterns and meanings and intentions, at the level from which the Anunnaki operate, the same reality appears as a coherent, purposive, intelligently orchestrated field of meaning. Both descriptions are accurate. Both are incomplete. The truth is in the relationship between them. This is not a new idea in the history of human thought. It is, in fact, one of the oldest ideas in that history, the ancient concept of the Logos, the ordering principle of the cosmos, which appears in both the pre-Socratic Greek philosophical tradition and in the opening of the Gospel of John, describes exactly this, a principle of intelligence that is coextensive with reality and that orders the apparent randomness of physical events into patterns of meaning. The Stoic philosophers developed the concept of the Logos into a complete cosmological framework in which every event in the universe, however small and apparently insignificant, is an expression of the rational structure of the whole. The Anunnaki framework is saying the same thing in more specific terms. The Logos, the ordering principle, is not an abstract concept. It is a living intelligence. It has a name and a history and a relationship with the human beings who were created in its image. And the synchronistic field is the medium through which that intelligence communicates with those human beings in the domain of physical time and space. The practical question, the question that matters most to the person who is experiencing the fourth sign, is how to develop the capacity to read the synchronistic field accurately. Because accuracy is the challenge. The synchronistic field is real, but the tendency to overinterpret random events as synchronistic is also real, and it is a failure mode that can lead to distorted perception, to the kind of pattern detection that slides into paranoid ideation, to the construction of elaborate narrative frameworks that reflect the person's own psychology more than the actual intelligence that is attempting to communicate. The Anunnaki communication through the synchronistic field is precise. It is not vague, it is not ambiguous. And one of the most important disciplines in working with the fourth sign is the development of the discrimination to distinguish genuine synchronistic communication from the random background noise of ordinary probabilistic coincidence. The most reliable criterion for this discrimination, the one that is consistent across every tradition that has worked systematically with synchronistic experience, is emotional quality. Genuine synchronistic communications carry a specific emotional signature. They produce, in the person who receives them, a quality of response that is distinct from the ordinary pleasures of noticing a pattern or confirming a belief. The response to a genuine synchronicity is not exactly excitement, though it often includes it. It is not exactly confirmation, though it may carry confirmation. It is something more specific, a brief, sharp quality of recognition, the same quality we have described in the context of the encounter dreams and the knowledge downloads. A sense of something snapping into place, of a piece of a puzzle fitting into a position that reveals the shape of the whole picture in a way it was not visible before. This is the emotional signature of genuine communication. It is precise, not vague. It is illuminating, not merely exciting. And it tends to be accompanied by the immediate appearance of a specific implication, a direction, an action, an understanding that follows naturally from the content of the synchronicity. Random coincidences that the mind interprets as meaningful do not carry this signature. They may be interesting. They may be gratifying to the ego that enjoys confirming its own beliefs. They may be exciting in a way that mimics the quality of genuine synchronicity. But they do not carry the illuminating, directional, implication-bearing quality of the real thing. The discipline of discrimination is a discipline of felt sense, of learning to attend carefully to the subtle differences in emotional quality that distinguish genuine communication from the mind's own pattern making. This is a skill that develops over time. It is a skill that all of the ancient traditions taught as part of the core curriculum of spiritual development. And it is a skill that becomes increasingly important as the fourth sign intensifies, as the synchronistic field becomes more active and more dense with communication. Because without it, the person receiving the communications can easily become disoriented by the sheer volume of what appears to be meaningful. Let us examine a specific example of how the synchronistic field operates in the context of Anunnaki communication. Consider a person who is deeply engaged in the process of understanding the Anunnaki framework, studying the Sumerian texts, working with their dreams, paying attention to their knowledge downloads. This person, on a specific morning, wakes from an encounter dream in which they were shown a diagram of sorts, a circular structure with 12 divisions, each marked with a specific numerical value. They write it down in their journal. They cannot immediately identify what the diagram represents. They go about their day. Later that morning, they are browsing in a bookstore, not looking for anything specific, simply present in the space, and a book falls from a shelf. They pick it up. It is a book on ancient Mesopotamian astronomy. They open it to a random page. The page shows a Sumerian star catalog diagram. It is not identical to the diagram from their dream, but it carries the same structural principle, a circular arrangement of 12 divisions with specific numerical values. The numbers are different, but the structure is the same. They sit down with the book. They read the relevant passage. It explains the Sumerian division of the sky into 12 sections, each associated with a specific Anunnaki deity, each assigned a numerical value from the base 60 system that corresponds to the deity's rank in the divine hierarchy. The person looks at their dream journal. The numbers in their dream diagram, they now realize, correspond precisely to the rank numbers of 3 specific Anunnaki, Enki, Anu, and Inanna. They have been shown a message that identifies, by name through number, the 3 specific intelligences that are most actively engaged with their particular activation process. This is not a vague spiritual warm feeling. This is specific information. It arrives through a chain of synchronistic events: the dream, the bookstore visit, the falling book, the random page, that each step is individually explicable by chance, but that taken together constitute a communication of extraordinary precision. And the emotional quality of the discovery, the sharp, illuminating recognition, the immediate sense of implication, confirms that the communication is genuine. This kind of multi-layered, synchronistic communication is the most sophisticated expression of the 4th sign, and it is the one that most clearly demonstrates the involvement of an external, organizing intelligence rather than the person's own psychology. Because the specific information contained in the communication, the identity of the 3 Anunnaki through their numerical signatures, is not information that the person's own unconscious would have generated. It required external data. It required the Sumerian astronomical text. It required the person to be in the right place at the right time to encounter that text. And the orchestration of those external conditions, the person in the bookstore, the book on that shelf, the specific page that the book fell open to, is what the synchronistic field provides. What the Anunnaki do in this framework is not magic. It is the precise, calculated manipulation of the probability field in which the person's ordinary life is embedded. It is the selection from among the vast range of possible events of the specific sequence of events that will deliver the intended message to the intended recipient. There is an important subtlety here that must be addressed. The synchronistic field is not a command and control system. The Anunnaki do not override the free will of the person they are communicating with. The bookstore visit was not compelled. The person went there freely. The book falling was not magically levitated from the shelf. It fell because it was placed imprecisely, or because the air conditioning created a slight vibration, or because the spine was worn. Every event in the chain has an ordinary physical explanation. What is extraordinary is not the individual events, but the ordering of them. The fact that all of the ordinary physically explained events occurred in precisely the sequence and at precisely the times that delivered the intended message. This is the art of the synchronistic field. It works within the constraints of physical causality, not by violating them. It selects, from within the immense space of causally possible events, the specific trajectories that achieve the intended communication. The Anunnaki do not need miracles. They have mathematics, and mathematics, applied to the probability field of physical reality with sufficient sophistication and at the right scale, can achieve everything that tradition describes as miraculous. The second practical skill in working with the 4th sign is calibration, the development of a personal lexicon of synchronistic symbols. Because the synchronistic field communicates through symbols as well as through numbers, through recurring motifs, images, objects, animals, environmental elements that appear at significant moments with a consistency that over time reveals a personal symbolic vocabulary specific to the communication between the Anunnaki and that particular individual. The serpent is the oldest and most universal of these symbols. Enki's symbol, the symbol of wisdom, of the forbidden knowledge that was given to humanity against the wishes of more conservative Anunnaki voices. When the serpent appears in your experience with synchronistic quality, in a dream, in an unexpected environmental appearance, in a symbol that catches your eye at a significant moment, it is specifically and precisely the signature of the wisdom transmission, of the knowledge download in its most direct form. The eagle is the symbol of Anu, the Sky Father, representing the highest perspective, the view from the celestial realm, the intelligence that encompasses and governs the whole. When the eagle appears with synchronistic quality, it is pointing toward the highest level of the Anunnaki communication hierarchy, toward communications about structure, about purpose, about the largest possible temporal and spatial scale of the project you are part of. The bull, which appears in the Sumerian iconography as the sacred animal of Anu and in the constellation Taurus as a celestial marker, signals communications related to foundation, to establishment, to the grounding of cosmic principles in material reality. Water, the element most associated with Enki, with the Abzu, with the primordial waters of wisdom and creation, signals the activation of the creative and generative dimensions of the Anunnaki inheritance. It appears at moments when new knowledge is about to be made available, when new understanding is about to arrive, when the creative potentials latent in the Gidam are about to be expressed in a new form. Learning to read these symbols in the context of the synchronistic field, developing the sensitivity to distinguish between ordinary environmental appearances of these forms and their synchronistic appearances, is the work of consistent, patient attention over time. It cannot be rushed, it cannot be forced. It develops naturally from the foundation of the first three signs, in the same way that fluency in a language develops naturally from the foundation of vocabulary and grammar. The encounter dreams provide the initial vocabulary, the symbolic images and beings that will later appear in synchronistic form in waking experience. The knowledge downloads provide the grammatical structure, the framework for understanding how the symbols relate to one another and what larger meanings they compose. And the body sensations provide the emotional calibration, the felt sense that allows the discrimination of genuine synchronistic communication from psychological noise. The person who has developed all three of these capacities, who has worked seriously with their encounter dreams, who has followed and documented their knowledge downloads, who has learned to attend to the specific physical signals that accompany Anunnaki communication, arrives at a point where the fourth sign transforms from a remarkable but disorienting experience into a reliable and sophisticated navigation system. They are no longer being surprised by the patterns. They are reading them, they are using them, and in using them, they are beginning to participate, consciously and intentionally, in the dialogue that the Anunnaki have been attempting to establish with humanity since before the first civilization was built. This is the horizon toward which the first four signs are pointing, not just the recognition of the presence of an ancient intelligence, but the conscious, active, informed engagement with that intelligence, the transition from passive recipient to active partner, the recovery in practical, daily, lived experience of the relationship between human beings and their creators that the Sumerian texts describe as the original design, a design in which the human being was not a tool to be used and discarded, but a project, an ongoing, evolving, beloved project, to be shaped and educated and ultimately elevated to a level of awareness and capability that might, in the fullness of time, match the awareness and capability of the beings that created them. We are almost at the fifth sign, the sign that puts everything else in context, the sign that is not a symptom or an event or a communication, but a condition, a permanent condition of the soul that has been present since the very beginning, that has been most acutely felt in the moments of greatest activation, and that is, in the final analysis, the most honest and the most direct expression of the Anunnaki presence in the human experience. Not a message, a feeling. The feeling of having come from somewhere else. The feeling of being on this magnificent but temporary planet, a long way from home. The language of 432,000 cosmic numbers in everyday life. We have established the framework of the fourth sign, the synchronistic numerical communications through which the Anunnaki reach the activated human being in the domain of physical waking reality. Now we need to go deeper into the specific mathematical language, because this language is more extensive, more precise, and more verifiable than a general introduction can convey. The ability to recognize Anunnaki numerical communication in your daily experience depends on knowing not just that there is a mathematical language, but what it says, what the specific numbers mean, how they combine, and what the communication is attempting to convey when specific numbers appear in specific combinations at specific moments. The number 432 is the most fundamental unit in the Anunnaki mathematical code. It is the number that appears with the most comprehensive cross-cultural distribution, the most consistent cosmological significance, and the most verifiable astronomical correspondence of any number in the ancient mathematical record. To understand 432, we need to start with the Sumerian king list. The list states that the total period of Anunnaki governance before the Great Flood, The era when the divine beings ruled Earth directly was 432,000 years. This number is not random. It is not a product of mythological inflation, the tendency of oral traditions to exaggerate the antiquity of the past. It is a carefully chosen unit that encodes a specific mathematical relationship. 432,000 divided by 60 is 7,200. This is the number of years in 2 Anunnaki precessional units. 432,000 divided by 72 is 6,000. The number of years that, in multiple ancient eschatological traditions, constitutes a complete cycle of human civilization from creation to transformation. 432,000 divided by 360 is 1,200, the number of years assigned in the Sumerian king list to individual Anunnaki divine reigns in some versions of the text. Every factor of 432,000 produces a number with cosmological significance in the Anunnaki framework. But the significance of 432 goes beyond the Sumerian king list. The number 432 Hz is the frequency that ancient musical traditions, from the Vedic tradition to the ancient Greek tradition to the Gregorian chant tradition, used as the fundamental tuning frequency for the musical scale. In the modern Western musical tradition, the standard tuning frequency for the note A above middle C is 440 Hz, a tuning that was standardized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that replaced an older, pre-industrial standard that was closer to 432 Hz. The debate between 432 Hz and 440 Hz in the contemporary alternative health and consciousness community is sometimes dismissed as pseudoscience, but the underlying mathematical reality is not dismissible. The 432 Hz tuning places the musical scale in mathematical resonance with the Pythagorean comma, the slight mathematical discrepancy between the perfect ratios of the harmonic series and the closed loop of the 12-note scale, in a way that the 440 Hz tuning does not. The 432 Hz scale is the scale that is most mathematically consistent with the base 60 harmonic ratios of the Anunnaki cosmological system. The number 432 also appears in the geometry of the Earth-Moon system in ways that strongly suggest design rather than accident. The average radius of the Earth is 3,960 miles. The radius of the Moon is 1,080 miles. The sum of these two radii is 5,040 miles, which is 7 factorial, 7x, 6x, 5x, 4x, 3x, 2x, 1, chart 5,040. The ratio of Earth's radius to Moon's radius is 3,260 divided by 1,080, which simplifies to 11 divided by 3. The combined circumference of the Earth-Moon system, when calculated as a circle with radius equal to the sum of the two radii, is approximately 31,667 miles, which is 432 multiplied by 73.3, a relationship that connects to the Sumerian astronomical system. These relationships were documented in the work of John Michel, whose analysis of the mathematical proportions embedded in ancient sacred sites demonstrated that the builders of Stonehenge, Glastonbury, the Giza complex, and dozens of other ancient monuments were working with the same mathematical constants, including 432, in ways that presuppose a knowledge of the Earth's geometry that mainstream history does not attribute to the cultures that supposedly built these structures. The number 1,296,000, which is 432 multiplied by 3,000, is the number of years that the Hindu cosmological tradition assigns to the Kali Yuga, the current age of the world, which is described as an age of spiritual darkness, of material focus, of the maximal distance between human consciousness and divine consciousness. The 4 ages of the Hindu cosmological cycle, the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga, have durations of 1,728,000, 1,296,000, 864,000, and 432,000 years, respectively. These numbers, 1,728,000, 1,296,000, 864,000, and 432,000, are all multiples of 432,000. They are all embedded in the same mathematical framework as the Sumerian king list. The Hindu tradition and the Sumerian tradition, separated by geography and ostensibly independent in their development, are preserving the same numerical numerical framework, the same mathematical language, because they are both preserving transmissions from the same source. Now, what does this mean for the person experiencing the fourth sign? For the person who is encountering 432 and its multiples and factors with synchronistic frequency in their daily life, it means that they are receiving communication about the largest possible temporal and spatial scale. The 432 pattern is not about personal guidance in the narrow sense. It is not primarily about whether to take this job or that one, whether to enter this relationship or leave it. It is about the epochal scale. It is about the large arc of cosmic time, the Anunnaki timeline, and about the person's position within it. When 432 appears in synchronistic contexts, it is pointing toward the person's role in the larger story. It is connecting them to the cosmic timeline. It is reminding them that their individual activation is not separate from the activation of the species, and that the timing of their awakening is not accidental, but is precisely calibrated to the current position in the Anunnaki calendar. The number 3600, the approximate period of Nibiru's orbital return to the inner solar system in the Sitchin interpretation of the Sumerian texts, is another number that appears with synchronistic significance in the activated individual's experience. Its appearance signals proximity to a moment of direct cosmic influence, the approach of the cosmic cycle's inflection point. The number 25,020, the length of the full precessional cycle, the Great Year, is the grand signature of the whole. When this number or its factors, 72, 360, 2160, 4320, appear with synchronistic frequency, the communication is about the grandest possible scale, the full arc of cosmic history from the Anunnaki's first engagement with Earth through the current moment and forward to the transformation that the cycle is approaching. The number sequence that specifically identifies Anunnaki communication directed to you personally, as opposed to communication about the cosmic framework in general, is the mathematical combination of the number 40, Enki's numerical signature, with the number 12, the number of the Anunnaki Council. When you encounter 40 and 12 in close synchronistic proximity, when they appear together, or in quick succession, or as components of a larger number that contains both as factors, 480, for example, is 40 POWs 12. The communication is specifically and personally addressed. It is Enki and the Council, specifically, in communication with the Anunnaki inheritance in your particular DNA. It is the most direct form of synchronistic communication available in the fourth sign's vocabulary, and it tends to appear at moments of transition, at decision points, at the threshold of new phases in the activation process, at moments when the next step in the journey requires a confirmation of the connection before it can be taken. The practical work of the fourth sign, as we have established, involves documentation. It involves the deliberate recording of synchronistic experiences, the numbers, the symbolic appearances, the meaningful coincidences, in the same journal in which the encounter dreams and the knowledge downloads are recorded, because the three records, the dreams, the knowledge downloads, and the synchronicities, are not separate. They are three channels of the same communication. They reference each other. They build on each other. The image from the dream reappears in synchronistic form in waking experience. The knowledge downloaded in a cognitive flash is confirmed and elaborated by a synchronistic encounter with a text or a person or an environmental event that directly addresses the same subject. The body sensation of Anunnaki proximity, the chest warmth, the pineal pressure, the spine vibration, precedes and accompanies the synchronistic events, providing the felt sense confirmation that what is occurring is genuine communication rather than cognitive pattern matching. Over time, as the journal accumulates, patterns of patterns emerge. The individual synchronistic events are the data points. The patterns between them are the sentences. And the patterns between the patterns, the large-scale structure of the communication, visible only when you step back far enough from the individual events to see the whole, are the message. Not a message in the sense of a brief communication that can be reduced to a single statement. A message in the sense of an ongoing, developing, progressively deepening transmission of understanding that is, at its full expression, a complete cosmological education. The Anunnaki are not trying to tell you one thing. They are trying to teach you everything, not all at once, The human brain cannot absorb it all at once, and the Anunnaki know this. They teach gradually. They build the curriculum on the student's existing knowledge and existing activation level. And the synchronistic field is their classroom, the medium in which the lessons are delivered, referenced, repeated in new contexts, and ultimately integrated into the student's living understanding of who they are and what they are here to do. What they are here to do. This is the question that the fourth sign is ultimately pointing toward, because the synchronistic communications are not just educational, they are directional. They are pointing you somewhere, toward something, a role, a function, a contribution to the larger project. The project that the Anunnaki have been working on since before the first civilization. The project whose goal is the maturation of a species that was created to be their partners in the stewardship of this world and this corner of the cosmos. The synchronistic field is the Anunnaki's way of steering you toward your contribution to that project, of placing you with mathematical precision in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge and the right connections to do the specific thing that the situation requires and that your particular configuration of inherited Anunnaki essence has made you capable of. This is not grandiosity. This is not the kind of inflated self-importance that the ego can produce when given a framework that seems to validate its specialness. The work that the activated human being is being steered toward is almost never glamorous in the way that the ego would prefer. It is often quiet, often solitary, often involves the patient accumulation of knowledge and understanding over many years without any external recognition or validation. It involves the kind of work that is done because it is necessary and because you are the one who can do it, not because it will make you famous or admired or financially secure. The Anunnaki are not interested in your ego gratification. They are interested in the completion of a project that has been in progress for longer than your civilization has existed. Your role in that project is specific and real and important, but it is your role, not anyone else's, and not greater than anyone else's in any absolute sense. The synchronistic field will tell you what it is. You have only to learn to read it. We have arrived at the edge of the fifth sign, the sign that is not a communication from without, but a condition from within, the sign that does not need to be triggered or activated because it was never dormant, the sign that has been present in you since your first conscious moment on this planet, the sign that you may have spent your entire life trying to explain to yourself and others without success, because there is no explanation available within the ordinary frameworks of your culture. The sign of the cosmic homesickness, the sign of the soul that knows it is far from home and that holds, in spite of that knowledge, in spite of the beauty and the meaning and the connection available in this world, a specific, irreducible, non-transferable longing for the place from which it came. You have felt this, you know what we are describing, and you are ready to understand finally what it means. Sign 5, the longing that has no name. There is a word in Welsh, hirith, that translates approximately as a longing for home, but that native Welsh speakers consistently say is untranslatable in its full depth. It is not simply homesickness. It is not nostalgia for a place you have left. It is a longing for a home that may never have existed, or that existed so long ago that it has become mythological, or that exists in a dimension of experience that the ordinary waking consciousness cannot access. The word carries within it a quality of grief that is not merely personal, a grief that seems to belong to a much larger story than the individual life can contain. The Welsh have a tradition that Hiriaeth is the defining emotional experience of the Welsh soul, that it is inseparable from the identity of a people who have spent centuries holding the memory of something that was taken from them, something that they cannot precisely name but that they cannot stop reaching for. The Japanese have a related concept, mono no aware, which translates as the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the piercing beauty of the world that arises precisely from knowing that it is transient. The Portuguese have saudade, a melancholic longing for a beloved thing that is absent, that may be gone forever, that is beautiful in its absence in the way that things can only be beautiful once they are lost. The Germans have Weltschmerz, world pain, the grief of the sensitive soul that encounters the insufficiency of the world to satisfy its deepest longings. These are not coincidences of poetic invention. These are independent linguistic encodings of the same underlying experience, an experience that is so common in human beings and so persistently reported across cultures that language after language has found it necessary to create a special word for it, a word that acknowledges that this feeling is different from ordinary sadness, different from ordinary longing, different from the grief of specific loss. What is this experience at its deepest level? Not the poetic interpretation, not the philosophical interpretation, the actual phenomenology, the actual texture of the feeling as it is lived in the body and the consciousness of the person who carries it. It is this, a persistent background sense that you do not fully belong here, not here in the sense of your current social or cultural situation, not the alienation of the outsider, the misfit, the person who has not found their community. Something more fundamental than that, here in the sense of this world, this planet, this dimension of existence, a sense that underneath all of the ordinary satisfactions and connections and meanings that your life contains, there is a reference point, a felt sense of home that is located somewhere else entirely, somewhere that you cannot reach by traveling in any physical direction, somewhere that you glimpse occasionally in the most beautiful and most expansive moments of your experience, in a particular quality of starlight, in a passage of music that arrives like a message from somewhere your ordinary mind has no access to, in the moment just before sleep, when the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond it becomes thin, and that, in those glimpses, fills you with a feeling so intense and so specifically mixed of grief and joy that you cannot hold it for long before you have to let it go. This is the fifth sign. This is the most ancient, the most universal, and the most deeply personal expression of the Anunnaki connection in the human experience. And it has been with you as long as you can remember. If you are experiencing the other four signs, the encounter dreams, the knowledge downloads, the body sensations, the synchronistic patterns, then this fifth sign is almost certainly not new to you. It is the oldest feeling you know. It is the feeling that was there before you had language to describe it, before you had any framework in which to place it. The feeling that, as a child, you may have expressed as "I want to go home," said inexplicably at a moment when you were already at home in the physical, geographical sense, and that the adults around you could not understand, because home, for you, was never purely a physical location. The Sumerian texts do not use our word for this feeling, but they describe its cosmic mechanism with extraordinary precision. The Gidim, the divine element in the human being, the portion of Anunnaki essence that was incorporated into the human creation, is not native to Earth. It comes from elsewhere, from the celestial realm, from the Abzu, from the cosmic source from which the Anunnaki themselves derived. It was placed in the human being by Enki and his associates, and it animates the human being, gives it its intelligence and its creativity and its capacity for symbolic thought. But it retains within itself the memory of its origin. It knows where it came from, and it knows, with the certainty of a compass needle that always points north regardless of what terrain surrounds it, that it is oriented toward that origin, that the home it is oriented toward is not on Earth, that the Earth, as beautiful, as abundant, as remarkable as it is not the reference point from which this cosmic element in the human being takes its bearings. The cosmic homesickness, as we are calling the fifth sign, is this: the Gidim expressing itself through the emotional life of the human being who carries it, experiencing the pull of its own origin. The feeling of being far from home is not a psychological symptom. It is an accurate perception. The divine element in you is far from home. It is millions of miles and many dimensions from the source from which it derived, and it feels that distance every single day, in the way that a piece of iron feels the pull of a magnet, not as a conscious decision or a deliberate choice, but as an inherent property of what it is. The Gidam pulls toward the Anunnaki source because that is what the Gidam does. It is its nature, and when it pulls, the human being who carries it experiences the feeling that Welsh speakers call Hiriath, and Portuguese speakers call Saudade, and the ancient Egyptians described as the Ba's longing for the Duat, the celestial realm from which it descended and to which it would eventually return. This feeling has been interpreted in many ways throughout human history, and almost none of those interpretations have been adequate to its actual nature. The most common interpretation in culturally religious contexts is that the feeling is a longing for God, a spiritual hunger that will be satisfied by closer relationship with the divine as understood within the person's particular religious tradition. There is truth in this interpretation. The Gidam is of divine origin. The longing it expresses is genuinely directed toward the divine, but the religious framework, in most cases, points the person toward an abstract, theological conception of the divine, toward a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and entirely transcendent, a God who is so remote from the human scale of experience that the relationship between the human and the divine becomes one of worship, of petition, of the absolute inequality of a creature before its creator. This is not the relationship that the Gidam is reaching toward. The Gidam is reaching toward the Anunnaki, toward beings who are vast, yes, ancient, yes, more powerful and more knowledgeable than any human being alive, but beings who are, in the deepest sense, kin. The relationship the Gidam is reaching for is not worship, it is reunion. The second most common interpretation of the cosmic homesickness, particularly in the modern spiritual communities that work with the concept of the starseed, the soul that has incarnated on Earth from another world, is that the feeling is evidence of past life experience in other star systems or other dimensions of reality, and that the person experiencing it is essentially an alien consciousness trapped in a human body. This interpretation is both more accurate and more problematic than the religious one. It is more accurate because it correctly identifies the non-terrestrial orientation of the feeling, the fact that what is being longed for is not somewhere on Earth, but it is problematic because the alien in a human body framework tends to create a sense of alienation from humanity rather than connection with it. A sense of superiority over the ordinary human beings who don't feel what you feel, who don't know what you know, who aren't experiencing the activation that you are experiencing. This is a failure mode. It is the ego's appropriation of the cosmic homesickness framework for the purpose of self-elevation. And the Anunnaki communication is not trying to make you feel superior to other human beings. It is trying to reconnect you with your own deepest nature, which is human, which is earthborn, which is also simultaneously and without contradiction of cosmic origin. The truth that the fifth sign is pointing toward is not that you are an alien. It is that the human being is a composite entity, that the human being contains within itself both the earthly and the cosmic, both the biological and the divine, both the temporary and the eternal, both the individual and the universal. And the cosmic homesickness is the expression, in the domain of feeling, which is the deepest domain of human experience, of the tension between these two aspects of the human composite. The earthly part of you is at home on Earth. It is native here. It is adapted to this world, to its light and its gravity and its seasonal rhythms and its social structures. The cosmic part of you, the Gidam, the Anunnaki inheritance, is not native here. It is a visitor, a very long-term visitor, but a visitor nonetheless. And it feels its non-nativeness. It feels the distance from its source. It longs for the frequency, the scale, the quality of intelligence and connection and understanding that is its natural habitat. And that longing, expressed through the emotional life of the human being who carries both aspects, is the fifth sign. The most important thing to understand about this sign is that it is not something to be fixed. The cosmic homesickness cannot be cured by finding the right earthly home, the right earthly relationship, the right earthly purpose. These things are real and valuable, and the person experiencing the fifth sign is not exempt from needing them, but they do not satisfy the Gidam's longing. They cannot. The Gidam is not longing for an earthly home, it is longing for a cosmic one. And the attempt to redirect that cosmic longing toward earthly satisfactions is one of the great sources of human suffering. not because the earthly satisfactions are insufficient in themselves, but because they are being asked to do a job they were not designed for. The cosmic homesickness must be recognized for what it is. It must be honored, and it must be given its appropriate object. The relationship with the Anunnaki intelligence that is the Gidam's actual source, and the ongoing, deepening, evolving development of that relationship through all 5 channels of the signs we have been exploring. When the cosmic homesickness is recognized, when the person stops trying to satisfy it with earthly objects and allows themselves to feel it fully, to honor it as the accurate perception that it is, something remarkable happens. The feeling, which has often been experienced as a source of pain and isolation, transforms. It does not disappear. The longing remains, but it changes quality. The grief that was mixed in with the longing lightens, because the longing is no longer experienced in isolation. The recognition that the longing is real, that it is directed toward a real source, that the source knows you and is reaching toward you with the same desire for reunion that you feel reaching toward it. This recognition changes the emotional mathematics of the feeling entirely. The longing remains bittersweet. It is not fully resolved and will not be fully resolved in this life, in this form, but it becomes, in the hands of someone who understands it, a fuel, a compass, a source of motivation and direction and orientation that is more reliable than any external guidance system, because it is pointing toward the most important thing, the thing that the entire activation process is moving toward. The return, not a physical return to another star system. The cosmic homesickness is not solved by spaceship travel. It is solved by evolution, by the development of the human being, individually and collectively, to a level of consciousness and capability that can sustain a different quality of relationship with the Anunnaki intelligence than the one available to a relatively young, relatively unconscious species. The Anunnaki withdrew from direct governance, not because they stopped caring about humanity. The texts are clear that at least some of them, Enki most prominently, cared deeply. They withdrew because the work of the next phase of human development required it. A child cannot become an adult in the continuous presence of a parent who does everything for them. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki from direct physical involvement in human affairs was the act of a wise teacher who understood that the next stage of the student's growth required the student to stand on their own, to discover their own capacities, to make their own mistakes and learn from them, to develop, through the full unmediated engagement with the challenges of mortal life on a physical world, the qualities that only that engagement can produce: resilience, compassion, creativity, the specifically human forms of wisdom and courage and love that no immortal, celestially native being could develop in the same way. The cosmic homesickness, understood in this context, is not just the Gidam reaching toward its source. It is also the source reaching toward the Gidam. The Anunnaki are not indifferent to the longing of the beings they created. The texts that are most compassionate in their portrayal of the Anunnaki-human relationship, the passages associated with Enki specifically, describe an Anunnaki intelligence that genuinely grieves the suffering of humanity, that wishes, at some level, for the separation to be less complete, that communicates through every available channel, through dreams, through knowledge downloads, through body sensations, through synchronistic patterns, not just to guide the activated human being through their individual development, but to maintain the thread of connection that the separation could otherwise sever entirely. The 5 signs are not just information being transmitted from one intelligence to another, they are acts of love. The expression, in the language available at this stage of the relationship, of a bond that was forged at the origin of the human species and that has not been broken by the millennia of distance and forgetting that have intervened. This is the deepest truth of the 5th sign. The cosmic homesickness is the feeling of a love that does not end, a bond that is not dissolved by distance, by time, by the amnesia of incarnation, by the cultural frameworks that have made it invisible. It is the residue of the original creation, the moment when Enki took the raw material of the earth and the essence of the Anunnaki and fashioned something new, something that had never existed before in the universe, something that was neither purely earthly nor purely divine, but was both simultaneously in a single being. The human being, the hybrid, the inheritor of 2 legacies, the carrier of 2 origins, the bridge between the terrestrial and the celestial. And the longing that lives in that bridge, the longing that is the fifth sign, is the bridge's awareness of its own function. The awareness that it exists to connect two things that are separated, that its purpose is not to be fully at home on either side, but to span the distance between them, and that the spanning of that distance, however painful and however beautiful, is the most important thing any being in this corner of the cosmos is doing right now. The five signs in concert, what they mean together. We have mapped the five signs individually. We have explored each one in depth, its phenomenology, its mechanism, its historical and cosmological context, its practical expression in the daily life of the person who is experiencing it. Now we need to address what happens when they appear together, what it means when all five are present and active in a single person's experience, and what the composite picture, the full integrated expression of the Anunnaki activation, tells us about the moment in history we are currently navigating. The five signs, when they appear together, are not simply additive. They are not five separate experiences that happen to be occurring in the same person at the same time. They are a system. They are five aspects of a single, integrated process. A process that has a specific developmental arc, a specific trajectory, and a specific destination. The encounter dreams are the opening of the channel, the first subtle re-establishment of the communication between the Gidam and its source. The knowledge downloads are the activation of the library, the beginning of the recovery of the encoded Anunnaki inheritance that was written into the human genome at creation. The body sensations are the tuning of the biological receiver, the physical body's adjustment to the frequencies at which Anunnaki communication operates. The synchronistic patterns are the navigation system, the external expression of the cosmic ordering intelligence that is steering the activated person toward their specific role in the larger project. And the cosmic homesickness is the emotional compass, the deep feeling of orientation toward the source that keeps the entire process directed and grounded in something more fundamental than any individual communication or activation event. The sequence in which these signs typically emerge follows a pattern that is not random. The encounter dream is almost always the first to appear, or rather, the first to be recognized, since it is likely that the other signs have been present throughout the person's life but have not been identified for what they are. The encounter dream has the quality of an unmistakable event. It is the activation that cannot be ignored, the experience that is too specific, too coherent, too emotionally overwhelming to be dismissed as ordinary mental process. It is the opening move of the Anunnaki communication, the one that is designed to pierce through the ordinary defenses of the rational mind and establish beyond reasonable doubt in the consciousness of the recipient that something is happening that requires attention. In the weeks and months that follow the first encounter dream, particularly in people who respond to it with openness rather than with dismissal or with the kind of anxious rationalization that suppresses the experience rather than engaging with it, the knowledge downloads begin to intensify. They may have been present before as mild intuitions or unexplained cognitive facility in specific areas, but they now become more specific, more frequent, more dramatic. The person finds themselves drawn into specific areas of study, ancient history, particularly Mesopotamian and Egyptian, astronomy, mathematics, cosmology, esoteric philosophy, with a hunger and a facility that did not exist before the encounter dream. They read, they absorb, and what they read is constantly triggering the download experience, the sudden sense that they already knew this, that this information is not new to them, but is a confirmation of something they were already carrying. The body sensations, typically, intensify alongside the knowledge downloads. As the cognitive and psychological activation deepens, the physical dimension of the process becomes more active. The pineal pressure, the spine sensations, the chest warmth, the nighttime vibrations, the early morning wakings, these begin to occur with greater frequency and greater intensity, and as they do, they function as a kind of calibration for the knowledge downloads and the encounter dreams. The physical sensations confirm, in the domain of the body, which is a more reliable and less ego-contaminated domain than the cognitive or psychological, that the experiences the person is having are genuine communications rather than the products of wishful thinking or self-deception. The body does not lie. The body does not have an ego to gratify. The body's report of Anunnaki frequency contact, the vibrations, the heat, the pressure, is the most reliable signal available that the channel is genuinely open. The synchronistic patterns tend to intensify after the body sensations have been consistently present for some time. As the biological receiver is tuned, as the physical body adjusts to the frequencies at which Anunnaki communication operates, the external world begins to reflect the internal activation. The mathematical language of the Anunnaki begins to appear in the environment with increasing frequency and specificity. The meaningful coincidences multiply. The precise encounters with the right people, the right texts, the right places begin to accumulate. And the person who is keeping the journal, who is documenting the dreams, the downloads, the body sensations, and the synchronicities in a single ongoing record, begins to see the architecture of the communication, begins to discern the overall message from the accumulation of its parts. And throughout all of this, underlying and grounding and orienting all of it, is the fifth sign, the cosmic homesickness, the feeling that has been present since the beginning, that is present in the moments between all the other experiences, that is in many ways the truest and the most continuous expression of the Anunnaki connection in the human experience. As the other four signs deepen and the activation progresses, the quality of the fifth sign changes. Not the longing itself, the longing remains, but the relationship to it changes. The person who has integrated the first four signs no longer experiences the cosmic homesickness purely as loss. They experience it as connection, because the longing, when it is recognized and honored, is not just the feeling of being separated from the source. It is also the medium of communion with the source. The Anunnaki are not available for direct physical contact in this phase of the relationship, but they are available in the quality of this feeling. When you sink into the cosmic homesickness, when you allow yourself to feel it fully without trying to escape it or fix it, you are closest to the source. The longing is not the absence of communion. It is the form that communion takes at this stage of the relationship. The integrated experience of all five signs in full activation is described in various traditions as a form of illumination, not the dramatic, supernatural, blinding light illumination of religious mythology, something more subtle and more durable, a deepening clarity about the nature of reality and the nature of the self, a gradual dissolution of the confusion that ordinary life in a culture disconnected from its cosmic origins inevitably produces, an increasingly precise understanding of what matters, what endures, what the actual purpose of human existence is, not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in the lived, practical, daily life sense of knowing, with increasing certainty, what you are here to do and how to do it. The activated person does not become superhuman. They do not develop extraordinary abilities that set them apart from other people in obvious ways. What they develop is something more valuable and more consequential than any special ability, an orientation, a reliable sense of direction in a world that is, for most of its inhabitants, profoundly disorienting. There are specific challenges that the person experiencing the full activation of all five signs will face, and it would be dishonest to avoid discussing them. The most common and the most significant is the challenge of integration, the challenge of living a fully functioning human life in the ordinary social world while simultaneously holding the awareness and the experience that the five signs are providing. This is not easy. The world in which most people live, the world of careers and relationships and social obligations and economic pressures, does not have a place for the activated individual to fully be what they are becoming. There are no institutions designed to support this kind of development. There is no community of activated individuals universally accessible in which the experiences of the five signs are normalized and discussed with the precision and the depth they deserve. The activated individual often finds themselves deeply isolated, surrounded by people who are, by and large, not experiencing what they are experiencing, and for whom the framework in which the activated person now lives their life is simply incomprehensible. The loneliness of activation is real. It is not the same as the cosmic homesickness, though it echoes it in some ways. It is the terrestrial loneliness of being ahead of your context, of having arrived at a level of awareness and understanding that your immediate social environment cannot easily meet. The ancient traditions had structures to address this: the mystery schools, the secret societies, the shamanic lineages, the temple communities that provided the activated individual with peers and teachers and a social context in which their development was valued and supported. Most of these structures have been dismantled by history. The challenge of the activated individual in the present moment is to find or create the community and the context that the ancient structures used to provide. The synchronistic patterns help with this. The Anunnaki communication through the synchronistic field consistently works to connect activated individuals with one another, to orchestrate the encounters, the conversations, the collaborations that provide the community of understanding that the isolated activated individual needs. This is part of what the navigation function of the fourth sign is doing, not just steering the individual toward their individual purpose, steering the network, the collective of activated individuals, toward the collective purpose that only the network can fulfill. Because the activation of individual human beings is not the goal. It is the means. The goal is something larger, something that requires not a single illuminated individual, but a sufficient critical mass of individuals who have recovered their Anunnaki inheritance, who have integrated the 5 signs, who have developed the clarity and the capability and the orientation that the full activation process produces, and who are working together, consciously, cooperatively, with full awareness of what they are doing and why, toward the transformation that the Anunnaki timeline has been building toward. The transformation is not the return of the Anunnaki in the physical Hollywood movie sense, the spaceships landing on the lawn of the White House, the disclosure of alien contact on live television. These scenarios may or may not occur, and their occurrence or non-occurrence is less important than it appears to be. The transformation is internal before it is external. It is the transformation of human consciousness from its current state, fragmented, fear-dominated, disconnected from its cosmic origins and its cosmic purpose, to the state that the Anunnaki always intended it to achieve. The state that the base 60 mathematical system, the astronomical alignments, the encoded genomic libraries, the dream communications, the synchronistic patterns were all designed to support and facilitate. The state of a species that knows what it is, where it came from, what it carries, and what it is capable of. The 5 signs are not the destination, they are the invitation. They are the Anunnaki saying, "We are here, we never left." The channel has been open since the beginning, and now, in this specific moment in the long, patient arc of human development, we are turning up the signal. We are making the communication louder, clearer, more insistent, because the moment has come when the signal needs to be received, when the library needs to be opened, when the human beings who carry our inheritance need to remember who they are and to begin, consciously and deliberately, to act from that remembering. You have been given the map of the 5 signs. You have been given the framework for understanding each one individually and the system they compose together. What comes next is not more framework. What comes next is the work. And we turn now to the final section of this script, the most practical and perhaps the most important, which is about exactly that, about what to do when you recognize the signs, about how to work with them, about how to develop the relationships, the capacities, and the orientations that the full activation process requires, about how to live a life that is adequate to the inheritance you carry. What to do when you recognize the signs, the practical path forward. Everything we have explored in the preceding sections has been building toward this, the practical question. Not the question of what the signs are, or where they come from, or what they mean in the largest cosmological sense. The question of what you do with them, how you respond, how you organize your life around the activation that is occurring, how you develop the capacities that the communication is trying to awaken, and how you navigate the inevitable challenges and confusions that arise when you are living with awareness that goes significantly beyond what the ordinary social and cultural frameworks around you are designed to support. The first and most fundamental practical step, the one that everything else depends on, is the one we have mentioned repeatedly throughout this script: documentation, the journal, the record. The systematic, daily practice of writing down the dreams, the knowledge downloads, the body sensations, and the synchronistic events that constitute the evidence of the Anunnaki communication in your life. This is not optional. It is not a nice-to-have spiritual practice for people who enjoy journaling. It is a non-negotiable requirement of the activation process for reasons that are both practical and structural. The practical reason is obvious. Memory is unreliable. The encounter dream that seemed absolutely indelible at the moment of waking has, in most cases, faded to a vague impression by the following evening. The knowledge download that felt like the most important insight you had ever received has, without documentation, dissolved back into the unconscious from which it emerged within 24 hours, leaving only a residual sense that something important happened without any of the specific content. The synchronistic event that appeared at the precise moment when you needed guidance most has, without documentation, blurred into the general background of your experience, losing the sharp particularity that gave it meaning. Documentation preserves the data. Documentation creates the record that can be examined, cross-referenced, analyzed, and used to navigate, not just retrospectively, but prospectively, as you begin to read the patterns and to anticipate, at least in broad outline, the directions in which the communication is steering you. The structural reason is subtler and more important. The act of writing is not simply the transcription of pre-existing experience into a different medium. It is a transformative act. When you write down an encounter dream, you are not merely preserving it. You are engaging with it. You are bringing the full cognitive and linguistic capacity of your waking mind into contact with material that arrived through a different channel, the channel of the dreaming Gidam. And in that contact, something happens. The two levels of the experience, the dreamed and the waking, interact. The language and cognitive structures of the waking mind begin to find the pattern in the dream material that the dreaming mind could not articulate. Connections appear, implications surface. Meanings that were implicit in the raw experience of the dream become explicit in the act of writing it down. The journal is not just a storage device. It is a processing environment. It is the laboratory in which the raw material of the Anunnaki communication is refined into the specific understanding that the activation process requires. The journal should be written by hand, if at all possible. This is not mystical sentiment. The physical act of writing, the proprioceptive experience of the hand moving across the page, forming the letters, tracing the images, engages cognitive and kinesthetic systems that digital typing does not. The handwritten journal creates a different quality of engagement with the material. And practically speaking, a physical journal cannot be hacked, cannot fail due to power outages or software updates, and cannot be surveilled in the same way that digital documents can. The Anunnaki communication is private. It is addressed to you specifically, and the record of it deserves the protection of physical form. The second practical step is the development of what we will call the practice of receptive attention. A state of consciousness that is deliberately cultivated, regularly returned to, and systematically deepened over time. Receptive attention is not meditation in the conventional sense, though it overlaps with it. It is not prayer in the religious sense, though it shares certain qualities with contemplative prayer. It is the deliberate orientation of consciousness toward the interior, toward the deeper levels of the self where the Gidam operates, where the encoded genomic libraries are stored, where the Anunnaki communication arrives, with a quality of openness and patience that the ordinary, busy, stimulated state of modern consciousness makes extremely difficult to access. The specific form that this practice takes will vary from person to person, depending on temperament, constitution, and the particular configuration of the activation they are experiencing. For some people, it takes the form of extended silence, sitting in complete stillness and quiet for a period each day, without agenda, without the attempt to achieve any particular state, simply present and open. For others, it takes the form of movement, specifically, slow, deliberate movement in natural settings, walking in landscapes where the electromagnetic background noise of modern technology is minimal, where the Schumann resonance is accessible without interference, where the body can be in direct contact with the Earth's electromagnetic field. For others, it takes the form of music, specifically listening to music tuned to the Anunnaki harmonic ratios, the 432 Hz frequency standard, or to the ancient forms of sacred chant that preserve these ratios in their original form. What all of these forms have in common is the creation of a specific quality of neurological state, reduced default mode network activity, enhanced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the deeper, older brain structures that process non-linguistic information, and increased heart coherence in the heart math sense. These are not mystical descriptions. They are measurable neurological states that correspond to specific physiological conditions. And they are the conditions under which the communication channels we have been mapping throughout this script are most open, most clear, and most productive. The third practical step is the development of physical health practices that support the biological dimension of the activation. The body, as we established in the context of the third sign, is not separate from the activation process. It is the activation process in its physical dimension. The tuning of the biological receiver, the reactivation of the pineal gland, the awakening of the spinal energy system, the calibration of the heart's electromagnetic field, requires the support of a body that is as clean, as vital, and as electromagnetic coherent as possible. The Anunnaki did not create the human body and then expect the cosmic communication to work regardless of what the body is exposed to. The body is the instrument. The quality of the instrument determines the quality of the music it can produce. The specific physical practices that support Anunnaki activation are not esoteric or difficult. They are, in most cases, things that common sense and good health practice have always recommended. Minimizing the consumption of substances that disrupt the pineal gland's function, specifically fluoride, which calcifies the pineal gland, and alcohol, which dramatically disrupts both melatonin production and the quality of dream states. Prioritizing sleep quality and consistency, since the encounter dream is the primary channel of Anunnaki communication and the dream state requires specific conditions to be most receptive. Regular exposure to natural light, particularly morning sunlight, which regulates the circadian rhythm and the pineal gland's melatonin cycle. Minimizing exposure to artificial blue light, particularly in the evenings, which disrupts the natural melatonin cycle and reduces the depth of dream states. Physical movement that is sufficient to maintain cardiovascular health and to move energy through the body. The sluggish, sedentary body is a poor receiver of any kind of energetic or electromagnetic communication, Anunnaki or otherwise. None of these practices are about spiritual perfection or the kind of rigid asceticism that some spiritual traditions have associated with the development of higher consciousness. They are about maintaining the body as a functional, vital, well-tuned instrument. The person who is sleeping poorly, eating badly, living in electromagnetic pollution, and consuming substances that disrupt their neurochemistry is going to have a harder time with the activation process than the person who attends to the basics. Not because the Anunnaki withhold their communication from the imperfect, but because the imperfect body is a less capable receiver. The same message will arrive, but it will be harder to hear. The fourth practical step is the development of a study practice. A deliberate, sustained engagement with the historical and cosmological material that contextualizes the Anunnaki activation. This means reading the Sumerian texts, not in simplified popular versions, but in the best available translations, with commentary that helps you understand the cultural and linguistic context in which the texts were produced. The Sumerians are not easy to read. Their thought is structured differently from modern Western thought. Their relationship to time, to causality, to the boundary between the human and the divine is fundamentally different from anything that modern Western cultural training prepares a person to engage with. Reading them with genuine attention and genuine openness requires the willingness to suspend the cognitive frameworks that ordinary education has installed and to allow the texts to be what they are, rather than what your pre-existing interpretive categories would make them. It means reading the secondary scholarly literature with discrimination, the work of scholars who approach the ancient material with genuine rigor, like Samuel Noah Kramer and Thorkild Jacobsen, whose translations and commentaries represent the best of mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship alongside the more controversial but often genuinely illuminating work of researchers like Sitchin and Hancock, who have pushed the interpretive envelope beyond what academic consensus can currently accommodate. The student of the Anunnaki framework must hold both the rigorous scholarly standard and the willingness to follow the evidence where it leads, even when it leads into uncomfortable territory, in productive tension. The ability to distinguish between what the texts clearly say and what is interpretation is a fundamental discipline. It keeps the study grounded in evidence rather than in wishful projection. It means studying astronomy, specifically the relationship between the ancient astronomical knowledge encoded in the Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian records and the current understanding of the solar system, the precession of the equinoxes, and the larger cosmological framework. The sky is the oldest and most consistent element of the Anunnaki communication. The Anunnaki came from the sky. They returned to the sky. They encoded their mathematics in the structure of the solar system, and the sky above your head, observable every clear night with nothing more than your naked eye, is a direct, unmediated connection to the same cosmic framework that the ancient astronomers were recording, learning to read the sky, not just as a pretty spectacle, but as a cosmological map, as an astronomical clock, as a system of specific intelligences at specific locations, is one of the most powerful practices available to the person working with the Anunnaki activation. The fifth practical step is the development of the capacity for silence, real silence, the kind that most people in the modern world have almost never experienced. The environment of constant stimulation, digital screens, music, conversation, the background noise of urban life that constitutes ordinary modern life is not neutral with respect to the activation process. It is actively hostile to it. The Anunnaki communication, while it can and does break through environmental noise when the signal is strong enough and the circumstances require it, is most clearly received in conditions of deep quiet. The encounter dream requires the silence of sleep. The knowledge download is most available in the quiet between thoughts. The body sensations are most perceptible when the body is still and the external environment is quiet. The synchronistic patterns are most legible when the attention is not being continuously consumed by screens and noise, and the social performance demands of a hyper-connected world. The discipline of daily silence is the single most powerful practice available to the person who wants to deepen their engagement with the Anunnaki activation. Not silence in the sense of isolation or withdrawal from the world. Not the silence of suppression, the attempt to quiet the mind by force. The silence of radical permission, the permission to stop, to be still, to allow the input from the external world to fall away, and to be present with whatever is arising from within. This is the silence in which the channel opens most fully. This is the silence that the ancient dream temples were built to facilitate. This is the silence that the shamanic traditions of every culture have identified as the prerequisite for genuine communication with the intelligences that guide and inform the human being's participation in the larger story. The sixth practical step is perhaps the most challenging for the individual in a modern social context, and it involves the question of what you do with what you are learning and experiencing. The temptation for most people who undergo significant spiritual activation is one of two things. Either to hide it, to keep it entirely private out of fear of being misunderstood or judged or institutionalized, or to proclaim it, to share it broadly and enthusiastically with everyone in their environment, out of the natural human desire to share experiences of great significance. Both of these responses are, in most cases, inappropriate to the actual situation. The hiding suppresses and ultimately stifles the activation. The knowledge downloads, the synchronistic patterns, the encounter dreams are not private property to be hoarded away from the world. They are information. They are communications that have relevance and value beyond the individual who receives them. Keeping them entirely private is a failure of the fundamental responsibility that comes with activation, to transmit what you receive, to contribute what you have been given to the larger understanding, to be a conduit as well as a recipient. But the indiscriminate sharing is equally problematic, for reasons that are both practical and ethical. Most people in the modern world do not have the framework to receive what the activated person has to share. They lack the context that makes the experiences comprehensible. They may respond with concern, or with dismissal, or with the kind of enthusiasm that actually distorts what is being shared rather than receiving it accurately. The premature disclosure of the activation experience before the person has sufficiently integrated it, before they have the discernment to know what to share, with whom, and in what form, often results in the kind of social and relational disruption that makes the rest of the journey harder rather than easier. The appropriate approach is selective transmission, finding the people, and there are always people, and the synchronistic patterns will help you find them, who have the framework to receive what you have to share. The people who are themselves in some stage of activation, who are asking the same questions, who recognize the language of the 5 signs from their own experience. These are the people with whom the full transmission can occur. With others, with the people in your life who are not in this framework, who are not activated in this way, the transmission takes a different form. It takes the form of the quality of your presence, the quality of your attention, the quality of the care and the wisdom you bring to your relationships and your work. The Anunnaki activation does not make you a missionary tasked with converting the uninitiated to the correct cosmological framework. It makes you a better human being, more attentive, more compassionate, more oriented toward what actually matters. And that quality, the quality of a person who knows who they are and why they are here, communicates itself without words and without the kind of explicit truth claims that would provoke defensiveness in people who are not ready to receive them. The 7th and final practical step, the one that integrates all the others, is the cultivation of trust. Trust in the process, trust in the intelligence that is directing it. Trust that the signs you are experiencing are real, that the communication you are receiving is genuine, that the path you are on is going somewhere, and that the intelligence at the far end of that path is as committed to the reunion as you are. This trust is not blind faith. It is not the suspension of critical intelligence. It is the fruit of experience, the evidence accumulated over months and years of documented signs, of tested knowledge downloads, of synchronistic events that proved their accuracy through the subsequent unfolding of events. It is the trust that comes from having been shown, repeatedly, that the communication is real and that the intelligence behind it is both wise and caring. This trust is also the answer to the 5th sign. The cosmic homesickness is not resolved by arriving at the celestial home. It is transformed by trust, by the lived, experiential certainty that the home you long for is not lost to you, that it is available, that the relationship with it is growing deeper and clearer and more specific with every dream you record, every download you follow, every body sensation you honor, every synchronicity you decode, every moment of silence in which you allow the channel to be open. The transformation of the cosmic homesickness from a painful isolation into a beautiful orientation is the lived evidence that the activation is proceeding, that the trust is justified, that the journey is real, and that you are, at this very moment, closer to the home you have been longing for since before you were born than you have ever been in this life. 5 signs, 5 expressions of a single, ancient, unbroken relationship between the intelligence that created you and the intelligence that you are. The dreams that carry more reality than waking life. The knowledge that was always already there. The body that knows before the mind does. The universe that speaks in mathematics, and the longing that never disappears, but that when you stop running from it becomes the most faithful compass you have ever known. This is not the end of the story. It is, in every sense that matters, the beginning. Epilogue, the invitation. We have traveled a long distance in this script. We began in the clay of Mesopotamia, in the oldest written records of human civilization, in the words pressed into tablets 5,000 years ago by people who were describing, not imagining, not inventing, not metaphorizing, what they knew about the beings who had shaped their world. We traveled through the mythologies of Egypt and India and Mesoamerica and the Pacific, through the esoteric traditions of the mystery schools and the contemplative lineages, through the discoveries of modern genetics and quantum physics and neuroscience that are, quietly and without quite realizing it, catching up to the framework the Sumerians articulated 4 millennia before the scientific method was invented. And we arrived here, in the present moment, in your life, in the specific, personal, ongoing experience of the 5 signs that constitute the evidence of the Anunnaki presence in your world right now. The question with which we close is not whether the Anunnaki exist. That question has been answered across thousands of years of convergent testimony in ways that only the deliberately closed mind can indefinitely resist. The question is what you are going to do with the knowledge that they exist, with the recognition that you are not a random collection of biological processes on an unremarkable planet in an indifferent universe, that you are the specific, deliberate creation of an intelligence that has been engaged with your species since before your civilization began, that has never stopped communicating, and that is, right now, in this present moment, as aware of you as you are, or are becoming, of it. The invitation that the 5 signs constitute is not complicated. It is not mysterious in the sense of being esoteric or exclusive or available only to a specially ordained elite. It is the simplest invitation in the world. Pay attention, write it down, follow the thread, be still enough to hear what is being said, trust what your body already knows, honor the longing that has no earthly object, and do not be afraid of the vastness of what you are beginning to understand about who you are. The vastness is not a threat, it is a gift. The gift of a perspective that is large enough to hold everything, the beauty and the suffering of this world, the extraordinary brevity of an individual human life, the incomprehensible span of cosmic time, the intimate specificity of a particular person's particular dream on a particular night, without being overwhelmed by any of it. Because the vastness, when you are oriented within it by the compass of the 5 signs, is not empty, it is full, it is inhabited. It is, in the most fundamental and most literal sense, home. The Anunnaki are with you right now. They have been with you every moment of your life, communicating through every channel available to them, waiting for you to develop the awareness to receive what they have been sending. The 5 signs are how you know this is true. Not because someone told you, not because a tradition demands you believe it, but because you have experienced it, in the dream that was too real to forget, in the knowledge that arrived before you sought it, in the body that vibrated with a recognition your mind was still catching up to, in the number that appeared at the exact moment you needed guidance, in the longing that has been pointing, since the very beginning, toward a home that is vast and ancient and absolutely unmistakably real. The signs have been given, the channel is open, the next step is yours. And the entire intelligence that shaped the human species, across the full, impossible sweep of its ancient and patient engagement with this small blue world, is watching you take it. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.